a framework for how state governments should think about housing policy. And I think this is particularly helpful for states that don't yet have a state-level policy that's sort of coherent. I'm going to outline 4 broad goals that I think are going to be applicable for almost every state. Think a little bit about some of the specific ways that these goals could be implemented, and I'm going to walk you a little bit through the approaches that 5 different states have taken so far. And just to give you some framing for this, I'm not going to wind up with one kind of template that every state can pick up and run with, because it's not going to work that way. States are very, very different in their housing market conditions, and this is both across states and then across localities within a state. That should be driving the decision about policies. They also differ a lot in the current laws and their institutional capacity, including something as basic as, is there a statewide housing agency? And if so, how many people work there and what do they know how to do, right? So you can't implement a complicated and ambitious policy if you don't have people who know how to implement this and have the expertise. And I will say that the states that I've picked out start from really different baselines, in part because some of them have been doing statewide land use and housing policy for many, many decades. And at various points in their history, they had either a political decision or a legal decision or both that pushed them to adopt a certain kind of policy. So, for instance, I think Oregon has one of the better approaches to land use regulation, but it's also really unclear to me that any other state is going to be able to do what Oregon did, because we're 40 years after Oregon adopted this, and sort of the general political climate is very different. This is a graph that is based in part on my subjective reading of the policies that I analyzed. So I spent a lot of time looking at state websites, reading secondary literature to see what they're doing. And there's sort of this interesting pattern. So the vertical axis is a measure of policy complexity, and I will say this is my ranking. The horizontal axis is a measure of housing costs, which is something we can actually measure. So of the 5 states that I looked at, which is a very small n to be plotting, California has by far the most expensive housing, any way you want to measure it. It also has by far the most complicated set of housing policies, and I'll walk you through what a couple of those are. Utah and Virginia really don't have a lot of statewide housing policy. They have some subsidy programs, but this is kind of a new area for them. They are also the states that have the lowest cost housing. Oregon and Massachusetts are somewhere in the middle. Now, before the economists get up and start screaming that this is a correlation, not causation, I'm 100% with you. It's not clear to me that if we got rid of all of California's housing policies tomorrow, that housing would become a whole lot cheaper, but it wouldn't hurt. So one lesson for states like Virginia and Utah is, you guys are starting without a whole lot of baggage. Don't become California, both in the sense of becoming really, really expensive, but also think hard about the policies before you adopt them, because once they're in place, it's very hard to get rid of. And a complex set of policies that push and pull in different directions are probably not the best way to go. All right, so I'm gonna outline 4 kind of very broad brush goals for states to think about. 1, assess statewide housing conditions and needs. This should be obvious to all of us who like looking at data. Not all government agencies work like this, but look at data and sort of figure out what's working, what's not before you start writing policies. 2, encourage housing production in places with strong demand. I'm going to spend most of my time on this because that's really about places where there's a need for more housing and housing isn't getting built or not enough housing at the right price point. This is the trickiest thing to get right. The 3rd, provide financial support to low-income households, relates to our conversation before lunch, and that's really the easiest one to get right if you're willing to commit enough money to it. It's just giving money to people. And then the 4th, reduce climate risk. I'm not going to talk about a lot, in part because that's not my primary area, but just to keep that in the back of your head. And I'll say across all of these, I would love it if policymakers would define a goal, identify the specific outcomes they're trying to affect with those goals, and then measure the outcomes and see if things are getting better. So if the goal of the policy is build more homes, then you should measure the success of it by how many homes get built, right? If the goal is produce more housing that's affordable to low and moderate income households, then monitor how much housing that gets built is affordable to low and moderate income households and see whether or not it's working, right? This sounds really, really simple. It is not as common as you would think. All right, assess housing conditions. So I'm going to pick just a handful of measures here, essentially to show you that there are a number of different things that states could want to change about their housing outcomes, and that what those things are going to differ across states. So I picked three fairly simple things to look at: population growth over the last decade, median home value to income, which is a measure of housing affordability, and then the age of the housing stock, particularly the share of housing built prior to 1940. So population growth, if we think about it as sort of the primary driver of the need for more housing. So states like Utah that are growing rapidly are going to need to build more homes because there are just more people to occupy it, right? That's actually very different across states. So Massachusetts is typical of a lot of northeastern and midwestern states that just aren't growing that much, right? They may need more housing at certain price points or in certain parts of the state, but they're not actually growing that much, right? That's a very different kind of tension than Utah that's just kind of exploding and needs a lot more homes. If you look at the median home value to income ratio, so this is sort of one of the standard measures we use to figure out whether people who live in a place can afford to buy housing. We tend to think of ratios between about 3 and 4 as being fairly affordable. So the typical household could buy a house, buy the typical house, spending about 30% of their income on mortgage costs. And so we see that Utah and Virginia are just under 4, so those are places that are not outrageously expensive. And I will say this is average across counties, so there's a lot of variation within states too. Massachusetts and Oregon are closer to 5, so they're pretty expensive. Some of that in parts of Oregon is because incomes are quite low in the eastern part of the state. But if we look at California, by any measure you want to come up with, California is just expensive, right? And in fact, a lot of the people who own homes in California bought them 30 years ago when housing was cheaper. And a lot of the people who are recently moving to California, or the renters in California, cannot buy the typical house in California, right? That's bad news. The third metric here, I'm just gonna flag Massachusetts. A third of the housing in Massachusetts was built before 1940. Old houses can be charming, they can be nice, but they also tend to have higher maintenance costs. And in general, when you see someplace that has a lot of very old housing, it means that you've probably got a lot of renters and homeowners who have either poor quality housing or spending a lot of money to maintain it. And so that's going to be a policy goal that maybe requires slightly different kinds of interventions than just affordability or building enough housing, right? So these three metrics, you can pick whatever metrics you like, but just to realize Utah and California and Massachusetts are going to need to have different state housing policies because they have different issues that they're trying to address. Encourage housing production in places with strong demand. So this is really the sort of binding constraint in a lot of expensive markets. I want to show you a couple of graphs to show you again that we're dealing with different kind of situations across these states. So this is one of my favorite graphs to make. I do this in a couple of different ways. It's essentially measuring the change in housing stock against housing prices. And you can do this with rents. You can flip the axes. You can lag housing prices and look at future growth. The graphs are basically all the same. The key thing here is that in a well-functioning housing market, we add more housing in places where people want to live, right? So the cities, the metro areas that have strong jobs, strong labor markets, lots of amenities where people want to live, those are the places where developers want to build housing because people want to live there and they can charge high prices and rents for it. So this is Virginia. This is, again, counties and cities. And here we see a strong positive relationship. The places that grew most rapidly over the last 10 years are more expensive places. These are the places essentially with high demand, right? So this is kind of what we would expect to see as a positive relationship. This is Utah. Also has a positive relationship. I'm told that Summit County has some very nice vacation homes and that people like to go there to ski. So high amenity value there. But in general, upward sloping relationship. Oregon, same thing. Massachusetts, same thing with, Nantucket is a little standout. They could probably build some more moderately priced workforce housing. And there's California. What direction is the line going? Downwards, maybe flat. California is not building enough homes in the places that people want to live. They're building more homes in places like Riverside than they are in places like San Marino, Santa Clara County. So California has basically broken their housing market. They build more homes in relatively cheap places because those are the places that have fewer regulatory constraints and you're allowed to build homes. The expensive places just don't build a lot of housing, right? Part of the point of showing you these graphs is it's not that Massachusetts doesn't have supply constraints, right? Anybody who's looked at the zoning of cities and towns around Boston, which I have done, knows that there are a lot of zoning constraints and that there are a lot of really exclusionary places. But it is localized within the state. The whole state doesn't have a supply shortage. California kind of does, right? And so this also implies that we're going to need different kinds of tools. California needs to think about how to motivate really, really large numbers of cities and counties to build a lot more housing. Massachusetts and Virginia need to target the places that are a problem. They don't necessarily need a policy that has heavy sticks that apply to all local governments, right? And so I think this is one of the really important questions as states think about how to encourage more production. Are you trying to do this for every locality within the state, or are there a handful of places that are really screwing things up, and can you target your policy to reach those? So there are lots of ways that states can, in theory, incentivize more production. How you design any one of these policies really matters quite a lot. So sort of the broad categories we can think about, right? As an economist, we like to use financial tools, we like to use prices and incentives. So I think most economists would say states should use carrots and sticks to incentivize local governments that aren't producing as they should. Identify the places with strong demand and low levels of production, offer them more money to build more, or withhold their current funding if they don't, right? And states do quite a lot of redistribution of funds across localities. So withholding, for instance, K-12 funding that gets redistributed is an option. It's also politically really, really, really hard to do, right? So the most effective policy economically may not actually be politically feasible. California and Oregon both have statewide oversight of land use planning. So they have to review and approve the plans that local governments develop for how they're going to use their land and how much housing they're going to produce. That's one possible way to get at this, and that may be sort of an upstream method. But I will say that having state oversight of plans without tying some sort of penalty to the actual outcomes produced is not very effective, right? So California reviews all of the housing elements, but it doesn't have any penalties for places that don't build the housing they say they're going to build, right? So these first two can be used together, but really it's the first one that gives it some efficacy. Creating a builder's remedy to override local zoning. How many of you are familiar with Massachusetts Chapter 40B, anti-exclusionary zoning? So there are a handful of states that have developed these mechanisms where a developer can go into a local government that doesn't have enough housing or doesn't have enough affordable housing, and they can override local zoning to build projects that meet certain criteria. That's not necessarily a solution to the fact that those places have exclusionary zoning, but it can be effective, and among other things, it's fast. Rewriting a zoning code is a really long, slow process, even for places that want to do it. And so a builder's remedy can allow you to go into places that should be building more and just build it, even if they don't change their zoning, right? So that's another alternative. And then the final one I've listed here, state preemption of specific zoning rules. That's what California just did by legalizing duplexes. That's what Oregon did by legalizing duplexes and triplexes statewide. The idea is that the state essentially prohibits local governments from doing a very specific thing, right? You can't ban ADUs, you can't ban duplexes. It's a popular thing for state legislators to do because it's a very concrete action. But ask yourself, does the state legislature know exactly what rule is the biggest impediment to building housing? Is the same rule the biggest impediment to building housing in all of the localities across the state, right? Does legalizing duplexes all across California fix the problem? If you're going to preempt rules, and you're going to do this one at a time, you better figure out what the most important rules are to override and get rid of them. And I think that's a really tricky question, right? This is popular in part because it's something the state can do once. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens, whether duplexes get built, but sort of the thought experiment of if Palo Alto replaced all of their single-family homes with duplexes, which by the way they're not going to do anytime soon, would that be enough to solve the Bay Area's housing crisis? So preemption, I think, should be on the table if you can identify the right kinds of rules, but I would caution against going to that as the first option or as the go-to option, rather than this sort of, let's define the outcomes we want, let's hold them financially accountable for meeting those. So there are a number of policy design considerations. I think this sort of question, does it need to be a statewide policy? Can it be targeted to some places? And thinking really about how you make these rules effective. Subsidies for low-income households, in some sense, is kind of the easiest question. So we know that all across the country, the poorest 20% of households, both owners and renters, have difficulty affording market rate housing without essentially having to cut back on other necessities. So as we saw from Andra's graphs this morning, this is largely about incomes having stayed flat or even falling at the bottom end of the income distribution. The lack of income is most directly solved by giving people money. And that's actually something that we know how to do. We generally don't want to spend as much money, and we generally want to tie strings to the money that we give people, right? But I think most economists will agree, like, if we just gave poor people more money, they could pay the rent and they would be better off. Not necessarily in California, right? Because landlords would absorb a lot of the extra rent, but in general, this is something that we can do. And it is really worth states looking at their particular situation. So for instance, in places like Detroit and Baltimore and Philadelphia, there are a lot of low-income homeowners for whom property maintenance, property taxes, utility bills are the biggest thing that they have. So that's a different kind of subsidy than poor renters, right? And it's worth having subsidies that are targeted to the populations and the problems that each state has, but this is in some sense really the easiest problem to fix. The fourth goal, reducing climate risks. I will just say that here, there's really a balancing act. So states want to encourage enough housing to get built, close to jobs, close to transit centers, to allow people to live car-light lifestyles, to reduce the distances driven, to reduce impacts on, for instance, greenfields development, which requires a lot of infrastructure. So we know that infill development is more climate friendly. How do you encourage development in the right places of the right structures, discourage development in, say, places that get hit with wildfires every couple of years, or places where sea level rise is already creating persistent flooding, discourage development in the wrong places, encourage in the right places without overly constraining the total amount of housing that's available, right? And that's a tricky balance, and I don't think any state has quite figured out how to do this, but just to keep in mind that those are sort of the two goals going on here. Oregon and California both have policies that are trying to do this. Oregon seems to be more successful. I think California offers an example of, CEQA was designed to protect the environment and prevent development in sensitive places. It hasn't done that. They're still building a lot of their housing in places that are very exposed both to floods and to wildfires. On the other hand, they have managed to create an environmental law that allows people to stop almost any kind of development they don't like, including things like bike lanes, which really ought to get an expedited approval, right? So I think you can say CEQA has failed on both counts of this. I did just sort of a quick summary in this table of the kinds of policies these states have to give you a sense. They're starting from very, very different places, right? So California has a very complicated data collection and analysis, lots of publishing. Their agency, HCD, puts out lots and lots of reports and data dashboards. Massachusetts and Oregon have some. Utah and Virginia do not systematically put out reports of their housing needs, and so that's a very kind of light touch place to start. Lots of different kinds of policies on the well-functioning housing markets. In the paper, I go into more detail on sort of what's working and what's not, particularly across California, Oregon, and Massachusetts, which all have fairly long-standing policies to encourage production with some success and some failures. All of the states have subsidies to support low-income households, but often structured in very different ways. So Utah's, for instance, leans much more heavily on homeownership, getting people into homeownership, and much less on rental assistance at the state level, although local governments do provide some rental assistance. So the takeaway from this is, I think states should have housing policies. I think they should look at some data and decide what they ought to be doing. For states that aren't in the game yet, start with some baby steps. Think about low-hanging fruit, like do an analysis of your housing needs, figure out where things aren't working, both geographically and for populations, develop some small policies. One thing I would really love across the board on housing policy at the local and state level is to do more experimentation, right? Come up with an idea for what would make things better, set some hard goals that you're trying to accomplish, try it for a period of time, evaluate it, look at some data, see how well it's working, tweak it, and figure out how to do this well before you entrench this as a law that's going to be there for the next 30 or 40 years. Really important also to remember, the more complicated the policy, the more work it is for state agencies to administer, to monitor, the more difficult compliance is. Complicated subsidy programs are more onerous for people to apply for. Keep it as simple as you can while still meeting the main goals. And think really hard also about the changes to incentives. So we have lots of examples of well-intentioned policies like CEQA, like Prop 13, that are trying to make things better, but they didn't think through how they were going to be used, and they wind up undercutting the purposes that they're really intended for. There's lots more in the paper if you guys want details, and I'm a little over, but hopefully we can take a couple of questions. You agree with everything.
Well, I have a question just with regard to the data that you pulled and so forth. I think most of us who are practitioners in the audience would say these are all great ideas, but we also are at the whim of potentially political changes every 2, 4, or 6 years. So, advice on that?
Yeah. So politics is the hardest part of getting policies right, as it turns out, and there's not sort of an automatic fix to that. I will say one thing that I'm wrestling with on sort of how much of this should be done at the local level versus the state level. There are states where the state and local governments work together as partners and they agree on the problems they're trying to fix and they're trying to support each other. So one advantage of having a state level policy is that it can make life easier for local governments that want to do the right thing, right? So mayors and city councils that would like to make their zoning more flexible, would like to build more, but they're worried about their voters. If the state passes a law, up in the state capitol, they're gonna take away some of our funding if we don't start building more housing. That can make life better for mayors and city council members if it's done well. But there are also clearly places where state governments and local governments don't trust each other, and sometimes where state governments are trying to tie the hands of local governments to do good things. So there's a risk that if the state government gets involved and does something that winds up making life difficult for local governments, that they will be worse off. And this is what it's really hard to talk about in the abstract, because I think there's some states that have managed to make this a partnership. One of the dangers of creating fiscal carrots and sticks for local governments is it does create a lot of animosity. So in California, the cities that are not compliant with their regional housing needs assessment, I mean, the state and the city are suing each other, and it's really bitter. Oregon has managed to come up with a more collaborative process where the state provides guidelines, local governments have some flexibility in implementing it, and they're viewed as trying to reach goals together. So if Utah can do something along those lines, I think that's the better road.
As a follow-up, can I just ask if you looked at the makeup of the legislatures, whether or not they're full-time legislators or part-time, and may have a business interest in that policy that they're passing?
I didn't specifically look at that. Of the 5 states, so Massachusetts, Oregon, and California have full-time legislators. California is sort of bizarre because they're term limited. Every office is 2-term limit, so people kind of cycle through a bunch of different elected offices. Virginia has a part-time legislature and a very, very limited scope of government. So their statewide housing agency oversees subsidies but has no role in land use regulation or production. I think Virginia is starting to think about whether they want to expand the state agency and give it more authority, and then they would need to staff up. The legislature there also, a lot of their laws tend to get written by advocacy groups because the legislatures are only in town for 2 months out of the year.
Thank you.
Are there states that offer vouchers, state housing vouchers? And if so, how's the outcome on that?
Yes, so of the 5 states that I looked at, Massachusetts does have vouchers, and they actually have 2 different pools. One is sort of in general, it's very much like the federal housing voucher, but essentially just supplements it. And that's a fantastic thing to do because it's very flexible. So a state voucher can be used for rental housing anywhere in the state. They can decide what the payment standards are. Massachusetts also has a special set of vouchers for non-elderly disabled people who often have a really difficult time finding housing units that fit them. But vouchers are probably one of the most efficient tools that we have for providing subsidies, particularly to renters. I'm a little bit surprised that more states don't have a voucher program. I don't know whether it's the complexity of administering it, but I think that's a great option. Yeah.
While encouraging companies to build in high-demand areas, are there states that have any particular state-owned housing programs that you would like to point out?
Most states don't own the housing that they, so there are a bunch of states that subsidize development of affordable housing. It's usually owned either by private entities or by nonprofits. Most of the states don't own it. California is actually thinking about creating a redevelopment agency that would build and own and manage essentially state-level public housing. That's fairly rare, in part because most public agencies aren't great developers and aren't great at doing the property management and the asset management. It's also potentially, that's a very long-term financial obligation and creates some also legal liabilities. You know, my personal opinion is if the state can provide money, potentially land, and make this a faster and quicker development process, they should be very happy to turn over ownership and day-to-day management to a nonprofit or to a private developer that does this stuff and knows what they're doing. Adam is giving me the thumbs up, which I think actually means we're done. Thank you very much.
Well, I don't know if my mic's on quite yet, but good afternoon.
We have to go that way.
Come on up, guys. We're being informal. I'll give you those 3 to comb. For those who don't know me, I'm Michael Parker. I have a wonderful role of moving in between Ivory Homes and Ivory Innovations, and it's a pleasure to be with you all here and see the intermingling of a lot of different folks we've worked with in a lot of different places, and what better place than Utah to be having this conversation this morning. So I'm joined by a couple of folks that I would say are a lot smarter and more experienced than I am. I've been in the housing.
Just a couple?
Just a couple. You're the third one out. A dirty secret is Cameron and I have known each other our entire lives, literally, and now find ourselves in negotiations often. So Cameron, why don't you go ahead and start with the introductions, and we'll move into our panel to react to Jenny's wonderful presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody. My name is Cameron Dill. I'm the Executive Director of the Utah League of Cities and Towns.
We represent municipalities
Across Utah, from Salt Lake City, population of 200,000, and the Schofield population of 28, and I'm not even sure I believe that number. Out of curiosity, how many of you are from outside of Utah? Came here for this event. Perfect. Well, welcome. Welcome to the best state in the union, and welcome to really, in my mind, the promised land. We have a tremendous opportunity here in the state of Utah. I grew up here. Michael and I grew up together, and Utah has changed substantially during the time since I grew up. Some cases for good, some cases for bad, and I think that's also part of the drivers of the policy discussion we're going to have around housing prices. So I'll stop there so they can introduce themselves, and we'll continue from there.
Awesome, thank you very much. My name is Adam Millsap. I'm the Senior Fellow for Economic Opportunity Issues at the Charles Koch Institute and Stand Together. I'm also a Forbes contributor, so I write a lot about housing. From Virginia, one of the states that Jenny mentioned, so I'll definitely have some insight from there. And yeah, looking forward to the panel and the conversation.
Nick?
Hi, I'm Nick Abbott. I'm the Deputy Director of Desegregate Connecticut. We are a land use reform group based in my home state of Connecticut. We were founded in June of 2020, so we're fairly new on the scene, but have been doing legislative advocacy around issues of zoning and land use regulation.
That's awesome. Well, we were really intentional to have somebody that's a practitioner, somebody that sits in a local government, somebody that's more in an academic and foundation space, and then somebody that's most recently been in an advocacy role around what Jenny just spoke to you about, to give you some perspectives. We thought before we jump into what we know, we'd react really quickly to the great presentation we just got from Jenny, and we'd start with Nick. He's up on the board, but what just happened in Connecticut in a 9-month period, as somebody that works in this space, is remarkable, that the fuse they had. But I'd love Nick to share with you a little bit about what Connecticut just got through and your reflections and thoughts on Jenny's presentation.
Sure. So, I think what stuck out to me from Jenny's presentation is the idea of that different things are going to work in different states. I need to think about what levers can be most effective for affecting the goal you want to achieve in your state. So in Connecticut, over the course of the past year, my group, along with a coalition of 80 partner organizations, advocated for the passage of a statewide land use reform bill. And I'll talk about some of the components of that in a second. But our focus was on to figure out how to build more housing in Connecticut, where housing production has been anemic, particularly in the most high opportunity areas in our state. And in particular, what motivated the organization of our group last summer in the wake of protests around the country against racial injustice was how to enable housing opportunities for people of color in areas where they've historically been shut out. So as we started to think about what would be most effective, and as Jenny talked about, what goals we wanted to achieve and how we would know we would get there, our initial inclination was to go down a preemption route, particularly in thinking about, okay, how do we get rid of just single-family zoning in certain areas? And certainly that remains a focus of our group. But something we've also thought about is what are the other barriers that are stopping the sort of denser multifamily housing from being built in high-opportunity areas? And what we found from talking to builders and others throughout the state was that there's a range of other regulatory constraints. Minimum unit sizes, parking minimum requirements, minimum lot sizes, and that by attacking some of those restrictions on a statewide basis, we could move the needle forward and actually do so in a way that, while we have attracted a fair amount of political heat and opposition, might not be as much of a third rail as touching single-family zoning, for example. Another thing I'll add is that we know, certainly, Jenny's work bears this out, that you need to be informed by research and data and the work that you do. So a tremendous focus of our group has been on researching land use laws in Connecticut, and having read through thousands of pages of zoning documents, it's not a fun thing to do, and I can't imagine that I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. But by doing that hard work, documenting the zoning practices in over 2,600 zoning districts in 169 cities and towns in Connecticut, we're able to get a sense of what the policies actually are, go to legislators and say, here's what we've found in terms of where multifamily housing is allowed, where it's allowed by right, what parking requirements are in place, what minimum use or minimum floor size requirements are in place, and start the conversation there towards more productive reforms.
That's great, Nick. We're going to jump to Cameron really quick. We've been on what I would say a journey in Utah around the housing issue. Cameron and I literally were sitting across the table from each other yesterday, negotiating on some prospective legislation coming this session. But Cam, you heard Jenny speak to kind of the difference in states in terms of how they approach this local control. Representative Waldrip touched on that this morning. We've had a spectrum on this, but I'd love you just to lean in. What's your reflections on Jenny's piece and then the Utah context from where you sit?
Thank you for the question, and Jenny, thank you for the presentation. I'm looking around oh, there you are. Thank you. It was really interesting and left me with a few follow-up questions actually for you. Before I get to those follow-up questions, you used a term of art there, Michael, and that is local control. When I became the league director 4 years ago, one of the things I wanted to do internally within our organization was define what local control actually means. Because what you were just describing, Nick, of the different land use regulations that exist out there, a lot of the tension that exists comes from local government responding to their residents and who's in the best position to make decisions that impact neighborhoods. Is it the state of Utah? Is it local government? And then that word control, I've always hated that word control. Even though I've spent my whole adult life at the League of Cities and Towns, I've always hated that word control because it's a negative term. It's local governments trying to dictate exactly what this is going to look like, and we want the state of Utah to stay out of our business. So ultimately, what we've tried to do within the league as we look at bills, not just in the housing space, but across all policies, is reframe local control toward respecting the role of local government, collaborating with other stakeholders, and focusing on the outcomes. So there are certain policy levers that cities can pull. There are certain policy levers the state can pull. Are we respecting each other's roles and collaborating toward those outcomes? And those outcomes really ought to be the enhanced quality of life of our collective constituents. So responding to the presentation, I mentioned, Jenny, I had some follow-up questions. And one of the follow-up questions I had is based on the comment you made at the end about how politics can complicate policy. I would love to see a comparison between states on local referendum and direct democracy policies, because the voice of the people matters in how their neighborhoods develop and how their communities develop or redevelop. And in Utah, we've had several really high-profile examples of both referendums or threatened referendums that then really make it difficult for local policymakers because they may make a tough decision only to have a few days later disgruntled residents come in and threaten to refer a project, and now you can basically throw policy out the window. Now, several years ago, the League was instrumental in changing local direct democracy statutes in Utah, and one of the key things that we did here was to try to take the handcuffs that previously existed on local governments off. So under the old law in Utah, and this, for those of you who are out of state, this may shock you, but under the old referendum law, if individuals came into City Hall to refer anything, not just a housing project, but anything, the local government leaders were handcuffed in their ability to explain why they voted the way they voted on the item being referred. But those who were organizing the referendum could essentially say whatever they wanted. So good policy and the months and months of deliberation that led to that good policy basically gets thrown out the window, and it basically turns into a salacious political campaign. So we tried to fix that, to empower local government leaders to explain why they voted the way they voted. And this gets to the point you were making, Jenny, about the political cover. We saw it less of wanting political cover from the state and more of the ability to explain why we voted the way we voted. Because ultimately, even if you get the state level and local government level policies right, if you don't bring along those residents and you're constantly faced with that threat of referendum and the threat of unwinding what's been done, or Dina, like you pointed out, just the threat of an election, and we saw that this year in the great state of Utah. I'm losing a lot of really good League members and good personal friends who lost because of an anti-growth, anti-development platform and sentiment in the general public. If we don't get those other pieces of the puzzle right, the policy levers are well-intentioned but don't actually get us to the finish line.
That's great. Adam, you just recently penned something around this with states in Florida, but your reactions, thoughts you've had as you've kind of looked at this on a more academic and practitioner level?
Yeah, well, first of all, Jenny, I loved your presentation. A lot of great stuff in there. I mean, I think the supply side is crucial when it comes to housing affordability. Housing is just never going to get more affordable unless we're building enough housing for people. So I think the zoning and the land use regulations should be at the forefront of all of the reforms that people are trying to do in their respective states or cities. So I thought that part of your presentation was very great. I also think there's a paradigm shift we have. We're talking about local control, so just building off stuff that Cameron and Nick were talking about. I think this idea of local control versus state control is also wrong, maybe for a slightly different reason, and maybe one that would resonate in a place like Utah, given the political makeup of the state of Utah. And I'm stealing this from my friend Emily Hamilton, who works at Mercatus on housing policy. But one thing that she always highlights is that upzoning or any kind of zoning reforms, it's not the state coming in and taking control from local government. It's returning property rights from local government to individual property owners, right? And I think framing it that way and saying, listen, we're not telling you what to do, we're returning property rights back to the individual property owners who should be able to do what they want with their property, subject to the norms of externalities and neighborhoods and all this kind of stuff. But a lot of this control that we've seen over the last 40 years since the late 1970s didn't exist prior to that, and that's when some of the best neighborhoods in the country were built. Some of the most walkable, some of the most dense mixed-use neighborhoods in the country. Go to any city and tell me which neighborhood you like the best. Chances are it was built prior to 1970. All right, when we didn't have all this worried about local control versus state control and all the SECA and everybody else trying to stop people from building things. So I think going back to that, subject to some nuisance rules, some general nuisance rules, would be a lot better, and I think we should frame it that way when we're talking about it. So that was one thing I wanted to say. And then another point that I think is really important when we think about housing again is that we have to get over this hurdle. I was talking about this before with some other people, so some people have already heard me say this, but the idea of housing being both a store of wealth or a wealth building strategy and also affordable. I think those two things run into each other, and as long as we try to meet both of those goals, housing is never going to actually be affordable. So I think we need to get over those two kind of cultural shifts when we're having these conversations about what the housing market should look like.
Nick, I'm curious to have you react to both those comments, particularly because your engagement with your League of Cities and Towns in the push. I know they probably weren't excited about the push, but they learned to engage and then ultimately, I think, got to neutral, if not yes, right?
Yeah, so we worked with our Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, which is our equivalent in Connecticut, and got them to sign off on some of our proposals, which is really important. Local control is oftentimes a shibboleth in many places across the United States. particularly in Connecticut, known as the land of steady habits, where the local town meeting, dating back prior to the existence of the country, is something that's held very near and dear. So getting to move the needle on that has been really difficult. And there's different ways you can try to reframe the conversation. You talked about one of them. Another way we try to reframe it is to point out the ways in which we already have statewide rules that apply to certain things. Fire codes or building codes. We have statewide, at least guidelines, and not rules that apply across the board. And in figuring out areas in which we could get broad-based consensus, including from the Conference of Municipalities, to say there's no reason why we should have different state-by-state rules that apply to accessory apartments, for example, or that would apply to, at the high end, parking requirements or minimum floor sizes. And that by getting consensus on those points, we are able to have a baseline foundation where, even if we didn't have certainly universal support, enough support to get something across the line. Now, the challenge for us, particularly at a statewide level and a state legislature, is when you get a bill passed on a particular issue, is how do you make it so that you're not checking a box such that we're done with land use reform for the next decade, but you're setting the foundation for this as the first step towards a multi-year process where we're going to continue to engage, ideally productively, in coordination with the municipalities and the cities and towns, and with other partners, but not just it being a one check and we're done, but something that's a continual process over time.
Cam, what do you make of that?
There are several interesting threads that have come up here. Let me first address something that Adam said on the property rights piece. Part of the fun of being a city official is balancing property rights. And it's not just the property rights of those who want to build, it's the property rights of the individuals who are already there. The city is also responsible for providing the infrastructure and the public services that go to those properties in perpetuity. So it's my experience working with my members is that it's not just as simple as reframing the argument. It's figuring out how that piece of the puzzle fits into everything else that the city is responsible for. So if you have a state mandate that comes in and says, thou shalt allow X, that's easy for the state to mandate because the state's ultimately not responsible for the infrastructure and the services that the city has to provide to that spot. And it's a separate category, but we're seeing more and more here in Utah, the creep of the state stepping in and saying, we want this type of development here, so we're going to mandate it, and then we will require the city to provide the services and the infrastructure. And that's a very troubling trend. It's bigger than housing, but the housing piece is part of that conversation. I am interested to hear about your discussions with the Connecticut League, because in many ways, we're having those same types of proactive discussions here with our legislature. So you mentioned, for example, accessory apartments. We had a bill this past session. In fact, I've got the scars on my back from it, where we were negotiating with
They aren't that bad.
Are you sure? Where we were negotiating with the legislature over accessory apartments. But let me give you a little context about that bill and the status quo in Utah. We had about 75% of cities that were proactively allowing accessory apartments and allowing accessory dwelling units in their zoning. And so about 75%, but we had 25% who were not. State law did not require them to do so. They had selected other housing strategies and had not selected ADUs. The legislature last year came and said, we think ADUs are a critical strategy to address housing affordability and affordable housing. And generally, most of our members agreed because 75% of them had proactively done it. But then the legislature said, we don't want to see this checkerboard of rules. So you mentioned certain rules varying by jurisdiction, and we were in the throes of negotiation over what rules the state could set versus what rules should be set locally. So for example, you mentioned parking. That was a huge sticking point because in Utah, we have cities that are being built into greenfield. So that community is being planned differently than, say, a historic pioneer community or a community like here in Salt Lake City, where you have certain areas that have really tiny lots and narrow streets. And so the more housing units you put in there, it complicates the ability to park, it complicates public safety and fire access and other things. But in other parts of the city, it makes a whole lot of sense. Our argument was that decision should be left up to the locals to figure out where it makes sense and where it doesn't. And the bill we ultimately got to neutral on did put a state mandate, but provided enough flexibility for cities within their own cities to figure out where it's appropriate and which standards the state sets versus which ones were left to locals, that our members could basically swallow it. Now again, what was interesting is that was a response by the state to feeling like 25% of cities weren't holding up their end of the bargain. So within that 75%, I had a lot of cities who said, we don't like the principle of the state stepping in and forcing us to do something that we are already doing, but we learned a lot of lessons along the way, and I'm curious to see if that becomes a model going forward, or if it was really focused on accessory dwelling units and we take different approaches on different strategies.
Sure. Adam, you want to jump in? I had I was going to plant a seed with you as you jump in, but simply to say, Cam's heard me say this, an ordinance isn't an outcome, right? So we get local municipalities, particularly where this friction point came with the legislature, where they may have passed an ordinance around ADUs, but the ordinance is so encumbering, as Bill from Pasadena will share, like cities have to get pretty proactive on ADUs to make it work. The financing is difficult. There's a lot of considerations that go, homeowners aren't developers. That's just the reality of it. So there's this tension between an ordinance and a policy statement, implementation. Jenny, you touched on state policy without a penalty, and Cam and I were laughing via text because this has been a 2-year comment. But I'd love you to react a little bit to this friction point with the state where there's an accountability piece coming in. So whether it's the accountability to come over the top of 75 cities have an ordinance, but we aren't getting the production side, or hey, it's not enough to put transportation dollars in front of you if the least common denominator still doesn't come to the table, it has regional implications. React to that a little bit as you come in to the conversation.
So I don't think you need mechanism-based rules for the localities. I completely agree with you. There can be outcome and output-based rules, as Jenny was talking about, that provide guardrails that cities can operate under. So land use is inherently a function of the state, and local land use only came about due to like state zoning enabling acts that happened like in the early 1900s, 1920s. They started delegating authority down to the local areas to allow them to do some stuff around land use and stuff like that. But inherently and constitutionally, it's a state power. So within those zoning enabling acts, a lot of states, so Florida, for example, that I just recently wrote about, they have to do comprehensive plans. So all the cities and the local governments have to do these comprehensive plans that explain what they're going to do with their land use. And once those plans get adopted, they have the force of law. So one thing states can do is within these comprehensive plans, you force cities and local governments to say, how are you going to deal with housing affordability, right? And they have to put that in their comprehensive plan. You're not telling them what to do, what mechanism to adjust, but you're going to say, listen, if your housing prices, you can set some baseline amount of like what the price increase is allowed to be in that county. And if it starts exceeding that, then you have to do something about it without telling you necessarily what to do in order to get the number back down. You can group cities together, so it can be carrots, so you can tie it to like intergovernmental funding, which is one of the things we're talking about in like Congress with the YIMBY Act, tying community development block grant funding to local governments. If you don't do something about housing, then we're not going to give you the community development block grants. You could do the same thing at the state and city level, right? States funnel a lot of money down to cities for a variety of things. They could tie that money to making sure that housing is affordable, right? Come up with a metric, right? And look at you can lump cities together so that, I don't know about Utah because you kind of have Salt Lake City and all the other cities appear to be much smaller. But in a place like Florida, for example, you can make like Miami and Tampa and Jacksonville and Fort Lauderdale or something. They all have to have, then you look at those places and see which one's doing the best on affordability, and they get most of the state funds. The ones that are lagging behind, they get fewer state funds, right? So it provides, this is the carrot aspect of it. Local governments aren't necessarily entitled to state funds. Then you could also do it with sticks. Maybe there's another way to punish them. But I think you can set outcome-based rules that don't micromanage local governments, but encourage them to do something about affordability. And don't hide behind things, which I hope Nick talks about, because I think this was in Connecticut. You guys got rid of character, the word character from the local zoning, right? Too often these local governments or people come up when they try to stop something from being built, they say, oh, it's going to ruin the neighborhood character, this nebulous character that no one will have to ever define, right? So I know in Connecticut, they got rid of character. Character is not allowed to be used as an excuse. You have to actually talk about what you mean explicitly, and then we can discuss whether the development is going to disrupt that or not. So I think that's another great thing that states could do too. You can't hide behind this nebulous character. You have to tell us what you're talking about, and then we'll see.
Nick, you want to jump in? I mean, did you guys approach the Connecticut reform from a performance-based, or do you think it was much more prescriptive than that? And then Cam, I'll let you jump in. I know you're ready.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you were to design an ideal policy, I think performance-based obviously offers a tremendous number of benefits over just, or an outcomes-based solution over a rules-based solution. I think one of the things that we thought about in considering something along that is what are the institutional mechanisms that are going to enforce it down the line? So is it going to be, do you have a lot of faith in your state Department of Housing, for example, to, if not turn the screws, to be a robust enforcer? If not, are you going to delegate that authority to courts, which we have a lot of discomfort with around institutional competency or democratic accountability? And if you don't, and also from a political standpoint, do you have a robust, whether it be from an advocacy standpoint or a business community standpoint, the institutions that are going to sustain a given political mechanism that is enforcing outcomes? So if you look at California, for example, that has the regional housing needs allocation, it does set firm production targets. It doesn't mandate them or penalize towns for not reaching them. But theoretically, they could, and I believe there's a movement to move in direction for creating some sort of builder's remedy for not meeting certain RHNA targets. For us, in thinking if we wanted to try and go down that direction, we felt as though we didn't have the institutional mechanisms and the political will and political durability to make that work, which is why I think we ended up going with a bit of the heavier hand of preemption, which is to say, in a fairly limited number of policy contexts, one we think that will hopefully to develop some of the political will and institutions to make for an outcomes-based system or a more robust set of policies going forward. But as a first step, preempting what we thought were some of the least justifiable local practices, where we actually got a fair amount of support from municipalities themselves to recognize that some of these practices weren't particularly justified, was where we started from before moving in a more sophisticated policy direction.
So as the local government guy, I'm going to talk about market forces for a second.
I love it.
Because part of the frustration that I hear from my membership is feeling like cities get unjustly blamed for market conditions that are outside of our control. So going back to some of the data that Jenny shared, when she showed the graph of Utah, for example, and showed the trend line, you mentioned Summit County being an outlier. Well, one of the reasons why Summit County is an outlier and Park City is the largest city in Summit County is because you have all sorts of market pressure on Summit County that Park City as an entity cannot overcome on their own. So you mentioned the ski traffic up there, but you have the market responds in such a way in Park City where it's more marketable and more profitable to build a unit to cater to a multimillionaire who wants to have a ski chalet than it is to provide housing for the service workers who support the ski industry, unless there's some sort of additional intervention or subsidy. Park City is incredibly aggressive at using the tools that they have to try to facilitate actual affordable units in Park City. But the market forces are extremely powerful there. When we look around the Wasatch,
I will say,
go ahead.
they are great. They are great, but it took us 10 years to get one of our developments through that had 100 affordable units. So even, I agree with you completely in terms of they bring a lot of toolkits, but even with that, if the political context isn't we want to be part of the solution, it's hard to overcome even that context. But I just color that in.
Well, I'm tempted to litigate that Park City example because even those, like what's affordable in Park City is still not affordable. Like,
Deed restricted, $400,000 median sales price, capped
Right.
depreciation, 50% of the homes go to
Right.
nurses across the street to a hospital. Couldn't come up with a better project, took 10 years.
Right. So Jason, do you want to litigate this now or?
I suggest any other place in Utah that's doing more for affordable housing.
It's fair. That's why I say the city's doing a lot, but the time context matters.
Yeah. Nevertheless, the market forces matter.
Yes.
And as we look up and down the Wasatch Front, which is where the majority of the population lives here in Utah, you have certain cities where the market forces are incredibly intense, and you need additional subsidies from somewhere just to get to market rate. So not even to the low income that Jenny was talking before, but just to get to market rate. So cities don't build housing. We plan for housing. We plan for a variety of housing types. And cities can and should be held accountable for what we can control. But often where the frustration comes from is when there is talk of holding cities accountable for market forces that are outside of our control.
That's good. Go ahead, Adam. And then I want to pivot actually to the solution side of this a little bit and pick your brains on, obviously you've gone through the Connecticut experience, but something on a local side that you can point to that you're like, that is a really great innovative solution on a local level. Yeah. So maybe pivot from there
I think I'll kind of pivot off of this from that. So one thing that I don't know what Utah state law is because some states don't allow these, but impact fees, I don't think they're allowed in Virginia for some reason. I don't know about Utah.
We definitely have them.
Okay.
They're allowed, but they're limited.
I think as much as people hate, I know a lot of people hate impact fees, and like I said, I'm more from the libertarian leaning side of things, so I have a lot of friends who don't like impact fees and everything like that. But I think impact fees can serve as a bulwark against some of the more exclusionary zoning that I see if they're done in a very transparent manner and they accurately represent the cost of adding public services. So I agree with you, right? Cities have to, when newcomers come in, you got to build more schools, you got to build more fire departments, you got to hire more police officers, you got to build more infrastructure. And all this stuff costs money, and not everyone wants their local property tax rate to go up just so they can help subsidize some new development and new local streets that they're never going to use. So I think impact fees, like I said, if they're done in a transparent manner, it's very clear. You lay out what the cost is going to be to build a new school. You lay out what the cost is going to be to hire new police officers. There's a schedule that's fixed that people know coming into it when they build a development. Oh, this is what it's going to cost per unit. You add that in, you get the money for your local service, you put an escrow somewhere, and you build the local services you need. So I think there's ways to get around some of this pressure that cities say they feel why they can't add new development in a way that is relatively market friendly, and if done with certainty and transparently, I don't think is really a big problem across the political spectrum, I wouldn't think.
And I would tell you, that's a really mature part of the conversations we're having in Utah this year going into the session is, what are those underlying financial incentives for cities? Yeah. What are their cost pressures? How do we solve a problem for them on the development and home building world to say, we have skin in the game around growth? How does tax policy inform what you do? How does economic development incentives inform what you do? What's transportation investments? So we're moving a lot in that direction.
And it might shield it from homeowners too who don't complain so much that they're paying taxes to subsidize the new development, right? The existing homeowners are already there. They don't feel like they're necessarily being charged for the new development. So one thing you can't let happen, this is why I say the transparency is so important, you can't have exclusionary impact fees, right? Oh, it's gonna cost you want to build a single family home, that'll be $50,000, right? That's what I say, you gotta be transparent, you gotta know exactly what they're going towards and how it matches up with the actual cost.
So as you think about solutions beyond what you just described, you've surveyed a lot of different approaches. Anything on a local level that you've seen that really inspires you as positive change?
In the sense of something that's been done, like a reform. So I think one of the things that doesn't get discussed as much when we talk about the regulations, everyone talks about the duplexes and getting rid of this, not getting rid of the single family zoning, but allowing duplexes and triplexes to be built on single family lots, which I think is great. But a lot of times the building envelope, even if you just change that rule, the building envelope still doesn't allow a duplex or an ADU or something like that because the setback rules from the side, the front, right, FAR ratios and all that kind of stuff. One of the things that Houston did, I actually wrote a paper about with my friend Nolan Gray, who's an urban planner. We wrote a paper about Houston's minimum lot size reform. So inside the 610 loop in Houston, they reduced the minimum lot size from 5,000 square feet to 1,400 square feet. And they ended up getting a ton of infill development within the 610 loop. So I think minimum lot size reductions is something that a lot of local governments should really look into above and beyond just the single family zoning reforms that a lot of them have done.
Cam, one example that you're just beyond proud of, whether it's in our market or not. I mean, you've served on the National League Board for the last 2 years, so you've had some broader context.
Yeah, it was interesting actually looking at those different states and hearing you talk about your states that you've worked in, because I've chatted about the 40B rule with the Massachusetts director and how it works or how it doesn't work. And I've had multiple discussions with my counterpart in California and the frustrations that her members have actually internally, where some were supportive of the mandate and some were not. What I think is unique about Utah, what actually gives me hope about Utah, is that we do have a spirit of collaboration here that I think generally speaking all the policymakers are seeking the same outcome. We're seeking the same outcome, quality of life. Now, part of the reason that we're all seeking that same outcome is within the state, we all feel these growth pressures and recognize that doing nothing is not an option. Now, in terms of policies that I'm proud of the mechanism that we built here a few years ago, which took a few of the different items that were on Jenny's list, and we're actually working to tweak it again this year and build off the examples or build off the experience from the last couple of years. And it is a mixture of state incentives and the carrot-based approach, but also a collection of better data and respecting local flexibility. And the whole concept was to say, here are the best practices around housing affordability and affordable housing. Not each one of these best practices is going to work in each city. Park City and Salt Lake are different, even though they're both in the same room here. But which ones make the most sense in each of your communities? Select those strategies, implement those strategies, track them, demonstrate, figure out what's working and what's not working, and then use that information and that progress to access state dollars that local governments are looking for, particularly in the infrastructure space, because that's where we see the biggest financial partnership between the state of Utah and local governments. And it's where a lot of the frustrations from our residents come from when they see growth, is feeling like there's insufficient infrastructure to handle it. So it is kind of that holistic approach that I'm very proud of the framework we built, and I'm excited to see how we continue to build on that while respecting everybody's roles.
That's great. Nick, maybe you can say something you left on the table that you guys didn't get in your reform that you would have hoped to have as part of it as you looked around the nation for ideas.
Sure. Well, I'll go with the policy. We got part of the way there, but wish we could have been pushed further on, which is on parking minimums. It's something that, when we think about a lot of statewide conversation on housing reform involve accessory apartments or duplexes, but something we wanted to figure out is how do we make larger scale projects easier to build? And it's hard to preempt your way to that unless you're going to do an SB 50 style bill, which is a bill in California that would have required fairly higher density housing near transit, which was not on the table in Connecticut. So what we found, and also has a tremendous amount of environmental benefits, was that if we capped parking requirements on all projects, not just affordable projects, we were the first state in the country to cap parking requirements for market rate projects as well, that can make a significant difference in terms of reducing costs to build new housing, preserving open space for new housing, and making it more environmentally sustainable. What we found in our research of zoning codes throughout Connecticut is that we had a lot of municipalities that would require 3 parking spaces for a new studio apartment, which is insane.
It's me and my 2 friends. That's your problem.
Right. And we know that
Some studios are so expensive, you have to have 3 people in it.
That's
perhaps.
it. We're thinking about that upside down. Well said, Adam.
And we know that even, the leader of our group, Sarah Bronin, she was the chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission in Hartford, which had eliminated parking minimums entirely. Now, that doesn't mean that developers, of course, won't build parking, but it means that they're not going to be mandated to do so. When we looked at research in neighboring Massachusetts, that a group that the Metropolitan Area Planning Council did, they went around at 3 a.m. to a bunch of apartment buildings all throughout suburban Massachusetts and counted the number of parking spaces that were empty in multifamily buildings. And they found that 30% of those spaces, which is at the peak usage time, were empty. On the other hand, we know that parking for commercial uses oftentimes is much more used than for residential uses. So we knew that there was a lot of misconceptions around how much parking was actually required, and it was overproducing parking beyond what was needed. So we put that cap into state law. I wish we could have been more aggressive than the one we put in place, which was for 1 space for studios and 1 bedrooms and 2 spaces for 2 bedrooms and above. But it's something where I hope that other states around the country follow that model, and then we can continue to push the envelope on.
I want to dig in a little bit as we wind down about this trade-off between these policy levers we've really been talking about and just plain financial subsidies and support around that. Utah's kind of gone through this maturation in our legislative journey over the last couple of years, and we're actually back at dollars need to be at the table. Cameron, in your mind, it's both, but as you think about this trade-off between we just really need to subsidize more very low income housing versus we need to solve zoning reform and the market as a whole and get a better business climate for housing to come out of it to produce housing that gets us to the same result. Your perspective on that trade-off?
I don't see it as a trade-off. I see it as a complementary approach, right? Like left to itself, the market is not going to produce units for people making 30% of AMI and below. So what is the role of government? And we may even need to knock that number up higher depending on the market and depending where you are. So how can government work with the market to produce or preserve the units that low-income residents need? That's a different question than your moderate income folks. That's a different question than your market rate. And then that's even a different question than your above market rate and luxury. So there are different policy tools that you need to pull at all of them. And the state has a role to play, local government has a role to play, the private sector has a role to play. And again, I keep coming back to neighborhoods and neighbors. They have a role to play as well. I thought it was really interesting, Adam, when you talked about reframing the concept of homes being the wealth centers for individuals and trying to think bigger than that, because I think that is a really intriguing piece, and it also is what drives a lot of the NIMBYism and the referendum issue that I brought up before, is when people feel like their retirement egg and their biggest investment and their home is threatened, even if it's a completely irrational reason. But once they feel that's threatened, of course they're going to react in a way that is going to have negative consequences on the overall market, right? So to me, the fundamental answer, and Michael, how all these pieces come together is how do you win really the hearts and the minds of existing residents so that you can start to see some of those changes and some of those investments. Again, I think all parties have a role to play, and I think collectively we as taxpayers need to recognize that there's a market failure to provide units for a certain segment of the population and be willing to invest our tax dollars into that. Now, whether that's directly into the units or the infrastructure that supports the units or taking down some of the regulatory burdens around it, there's certainly that role to play for government. And really, when we say government, we're really talking about the elected officials of the taxpayers who are paying the taxes to subsidize it.
Adam?
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason we need subsidies is housing is so expensive. So to the extent that the taxpayers are going to be subsidizing it, maybe if someone can explain that link to them a little bit better, they might be like, oh wow, maybe I should just make it easier to build housing so that I'm not paying all these tax dollars to subsidize the other units. And when it comes to the subsidy, I'd much rather give them to the individual. So I know Jenny had something in there. I think it was in her presentation about the Section 8 program, or maybe she didn't, but I thought I saw it somewhere. I think cash-based assistance to lower income people is the way to go. I don't like this in-kind assistance, such like a Section 8 voucher for a couple different reasons. First,
we have a big LIHTC discussion in tomorrow, Abby. Today, so this afternoon.
Perfect. I'll build into that then. So I don't like the Section 8 stuff for two big reasons. First, I think that it's kind of demeaning to people. So one of the things we always say at Stand Together is we want to empower people to self-actualize. I think people know what they need, the trade-offs they face, the goals they're trying to pursue. So I'd rather just, to the extent we're going to help them, let's just give them the money and let them make those trade-offs. However they're going to do it. So I'd much rather see just means-tested cash assistance. And if that has to happen in housing first, then so be it, and we can go from there. I also think that the Section 8 voucher, when you give stuff like in-kind support to people, it keeps them out of certain neighborhoods because Section 8 is a voluntary program. So in some neighborhoods, you won't have any Section 8 renters. So you won't be able to go in there and get it because there's no landlords who allow Section 8 housing. Right. If the money is just going right to the people and it's cash, it's just as green to the landlord as anybody else's money is. So they won't be able to discriminate on Section 8 or the cash assistance if it's going to the people first rather than going to the landlord. So I think from a practical standpoint, it makes more sense to give it to the people. I don't like things like inclusionary zoning. Again, my friend Emily, who could say this better than she could say everything I'm saying, just better if she was here. I just steal all my ideas from her. But inclusionary zoning, I have a problem with that, those bonuses, because they only work in places where housing is already expensive. If housing is not expensive, the bonus you get for more market rate units is not enough to cover the cost of the subsidies on the front end. So inclusionary zoning only work in a weird equilibrium where you already have really expensive housing. So once the housing gets more affordable, the inclusionary zoning doesn't matter anymore because no one's going to take advantage of it because it doesn't justify itself. So I think ultimately it's just not a winning strategy for bringing housing down and making it more affordable long term.
Interesting. Nick, you guys landed on one side of the coin. I've been highly sensitive. As you can tell, I like to sit in the middle politically and move between Clark and Cameron. and one pays my bills, so that's one thing. But I would just say, for our state legislature, it's not enough to lean on the locals and come out with a toolkit of policy proposals. They've got to bring cash to the table too to be part of the solution. We did that last year in a big way, but you did policy reform. Is there a financial component that's happening back home to say the state's got skin in the game and the solution specifically around that low-income population?
Yeah, there's definitely, impetus from the state to try to use its resources, mix of carrots and sticks, and as well as to do more direct subsidies, whether it be on the demand side or on the supply side. I think one of the things that we struggle with in thinking about, state injections of funds is that, I tend to think from an economic perspective, but localities are not rational actors, or at least they're not rational from a budget maximizing perspective, right? They have other values at stake and they're subject to their voters, as they should be. So just offering money from the state or threatening to take money away in exchange for certain actions isn't always going to generate the outcomes that we want. So figuring out the best ways to partner with cities, to listen to cities about what they need to get done, partnering with them on sewer and water development is a big issue in Connecticut, and one that we know can enable more housing development going forward. Also helping with some of the, a lot of cities and towns want to update their zoning codes, for example, to adopt form-based zoning, but it costs a lot of money to do that. So we developed, as part of our statewide reform, a statewide committee that develops model design guidelines that localities can then adapt, and adopting some of those cooperative ways and leveraging state funding so that localities aren't spending all this money on their own or can take advantage of those resources is one, a collaborative, important way to get to where we're going. It's our view that, limited to the Connecticut context, that's not going to be enough to get to where we want to go, but certainly it's going to vary state by state in figuring out the right mix of incentives and harder tools to generate the outcomes you want on a statewide level.
So we have 5 minutes left. I think it would be a miss if we didn't have you share a little bit. Alanna McCargo talked about the racial equity. We heard the data of the next surge of buyers that are coming through. But particular to your reform, Minneapolis had gone this way on a city level. We recognized them through the Ivory Prize 2 years ago. Oregon did the same thing. We've seen California do it, but again, it was in the context of a housing crisis, not a racial equity. But you had that overlaid in such a big way. How do you think that's going to play out in other states as they think about zoning reform? And do you think that's as big of a piece, or did you guys just hit it in the right moment where the public attention was there? And then, guys, I'll come to a closing comment for each of you.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting to see what triggers different housing reform movements in different states. I think in California, it's certainly been precipitated by an affordability crisis. And in Connecticut, it was a lot of racial justice groups that have historically organized around this issue and that are continuing to do so. So the NAACP in Connecticut, dating back to the 1960s, were organizing for statewide rules around minimum lot sizes. And for housing to be coded for so long as a racial justice issue, has been, I think, clarifying in certain ways, productive in certain ways, and polarizing in other ways. And I think it was important for our group to address that head on, particularly given the climate in which we were born into, not to certainly leverage that energy, but to recognize the reality of what the consequences of our housing policies were, and to make sure that everyone in our state who was concerned about racial inequity was recognizing the ways in which our housing policies exacerbated or helped to diminish those inequities. So certainly that's going to be a continued part of our focus going forward. I mentioned at the beginning, our group, our direction is formed by an 80-group coalition, and most of those groups are racial justice groups from individual towns throughout our state. And they're going to continue to make sure that our policies put racial equity front and center, in addition to the broader economic and environmental concerns that animate a lot of our members.
That's great. Adam, let's look ahead. Something you're excited about, trend you're seeing, as tie a bow on kind of what the future looks like in this dynamic between state and local.
I think from a research perspective, where we need more stuff done is on the political economy side. So how do you form the coalitions needed in order to get some of this stuff across the finish line? It's happened in some states, but you see cities that look kind of similar, where sometimes they get zoning reform and sometimes they don't. I think of, like Raleigh has some zoning reform, Charlotte had some zoning reform. They tried to do something similar in Atlanta, and it got stymied. So what was different in Raleigh and Charlotte that wasn't the case in Atlanta? So what kind of groups do you need to bring to the table? Do you need to get on board before you can get something across the finish line politically? I think we know, due to the good work of people like Jenny and the researchers out there who have pointed out the effects that zoning has on housing prices. I think we know that the land use restrictions are the problem, that the regulations are the problem, but then reforming them, that's where I think we need a lot more research and understanding how that happens.
Cameron, look ahead. Other than hanging out with me through the whole session, you're really excited about that, but what else gets you encouraged? I mean, I think our state's finding we're at a crisis moment, frankly. First time in state history, we're priced out more people than priced in. That's a big change. First time in 40 years, we're producing less homes than we have households growing. Utah has grown in a real way, high growth state. You've talked about the growth fatigue. I mean, we have a lot of big challenges for a small state to get our arms around. What gives you any kind of sense of hope that other than we can remember high school together?
Right. Well, and junior high and elementary. But that's actually where I'm going to go, is because Utah currently has tremendous quality of life, and I think everybody across the state wants to preserve that for the next generation. So there is that common bond there. What gives me hope is I look over the last 3 years, and we actually are producing more housing units than we are households. We're having conversations in city halls and county commission chambers and other halls of government about how do we plan for growth to maximize our limited resources. Utah is unique because we have mountains on both sides of the metro area. You probably saw the lake as you flew in. It's shrinking, and that's a whole nother conversation. But we're really at this intersection right now of what we've been before and what we're going to be. And that is hard. That is hard. The neighborhood where we grew up used to be surrounded by open space. It no longer is. It is basically now surrounded by houses. There are still a few little infill projects that can be built. But one of the amenities that didn't exist when we were kids that exists now is the Jordan River Parkway. And it's a fantastic parkway where people can recreate and spend time together with families. And that has actually made it easier to see some of the open space get developed because there was still that quality of life amenity there. So part of what gives me hope is that we're having this big picture conversation, and it comes back to me for quality of life, which really means access to opportunity. It means access to jobs. It means access to education. It means access to parks and open space. It means access to housing that people can afford, access to good transportation. Simply building housing, regardless of the location, is not the answer. The answer is that integrated planning, and I think we do a pretty good job of that here in Utah, and I think the last few years has put a spotlight on how we can do it better and how we can integrate the private sector, local government, state government, and the residents themselves in ensuring that we're planning to preserve that quality of life today and tomorrow.
Hear, hear. Well, thanks to the great panel, and Jenny, thank you so much for a great presentation to react to. So.
We're just going to take a 15-minute break, so we'll see you back here at 3:15. Thanks.
Yeah, that one. That one. So we do it. Oh, I was getting
This is why the state is preempt.
Right, no, right. And the state's the one that so yeah, so what do we read? Not even the biggest one. So the impact piece can be interesting. Right, exactly. It doesn't change the exactly, right. So it moves the needle in the right way, not enough. So is it something where take some of the property taxes? Some people say it's a some people say no. Yes, they are more politically escaped.
Tax on new development and using it to pay down current residency, right? Everyone benefits from the growth.
Right. Okay. So he
So you buy,
so he's writing an actual paper.
Yeah, I don't know how. Sure. But I mean, maybe that's.
Right. No,
Go for this plan.
Exactly. That's I hadn't even heard it today. I'm glad it's like a good link, I guess. I didn't know that's exactly the idea, which is to take some property tax. But I hadn't thought as deeply enough to have to make.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think anyone's going to get use of the rates.
Right. Or supposedly the existing owner sells their house to a new person. Does that person can get the
do they get in
flow, or is it only
the voucher, just give them money. It's interesting because I guess so. We have a lot of thoughts in response to what you said. Just ours.
That's the.
we went through 5 rounds of red line.
Yeah.
And Salt Lake City use this
kind of like performance. I think of like, carbon emissions. And then we'll optimize. Yeah.
It's a 3-month.
I think there's arguments for sure that. Yes, but educational opportunity, educational information. Which is why I'm wondering if you spoke with anyone that's involved in the programs or anyone who's about
They know.
So I think 2 things that I really want to bring up. Like, one is just I've never been in a situation where I couldn't
this is where it gets
access to public communities. Maybe when I think about like access to opportunity neighborhoods. Yeah, you gotta find out about this. And
especially now.
Yeah. And so I think that's something that, I'll just say it was a bit of a discussion. I've never been. I've been in New York, but I moved from Philadelphia to Cleveland, and I got annoyed that I had to buy a car. You're from Ohio? Where are you from? Okay. Well, yeah. So I, I've never been in a situation where that was like. I think it's just one of those things that I understand. And so I think that's a really big one. Access to transportation, especially.
We're so proud of that. You guys are.
I'm thinking about this a lot because we're talking about this issue. And I actually don't know what and they were finding some different results. I don't remember how.
Yeah, I don't think there's a full consensus. I'm aware of it, but it's more like mixed evidence right now.
Yeah, just do in kind and in the sense of like none instead of or because I was actually shocked. It's a lot less. Maybe. And maybe that'll come later, right? Maybe it'll come later. But I think there's other studies too where it's all. I'm not saying zero discrimination. I think the source of income and the question is if that's when they start loading onto. I'm sure
no, because there's right. There's I still think it'd be hard to show around squeeze for seeing.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. But it's more that it's like where my mind goes.
No, it's tricky because Andy to care on manual credit checks to get a job. And I think he probably has to
He's co-opted low back.
Oh, they okay. Yeah, okay.
So you can low back and you go get your credit checks. They're looking for something.
No, this is the tough thing. I'm actually teaching undergrad labor right now. Just I know you started statistics. Right. It's tough. I agree with you. It's not a panic. Even though if I had the money for 16,000, I could
So they're kind of a housing mobility. I'll send you an email. I love to talk to you about this. Research in the area, and I think there was a comment. Yeah, so I don't know that it comments on weird. Yeah, but
to me, it's a cash subject.
Well, no, and I think. But I think the point is like there's a lot of places. One where it's just like it's overwhelming, but it's one where I think it's very strong. It's like just people passion. It's like
People having a hard time buying groceries. No, we said just checks.
Yeah, so anyway, when you think about something, do sometimes but you know, I do think it's almost like there's a certain amount of you just can't get out of it. The more I think about it, I don't know. I'm curious about some of those UBI.
I guess if you wanted to basically tailor the amount to like equal costs. I'd say voucher. The smallest thing is just take the same voucher value and just give them money. So however that's calibrated and for cost of living.
Oh, sure, you're finding it. I mean, that is such a big argument. It's like, like we're not even talking about like scope of government.
No,
like we're just talking and I think
where it's such
or something like, or 10%. Yeah, like, just see
it is a total cycle. It is really how many people
that's going to be So I'm originally from my dad's Serbian, my mom's Croatian. We were born in Bosnia, so since '97. So
Okay.
been here a while.
I don't remember, we overlapped, I don't remember how many. When did you finish?
I used to be stationed.
Okay, so I did yeah. That's right.
No way. Yeah, so what year was this? So probably essentially the idea is I think there's a long way.
You just, I can see that too. The program hasn't been established. You decided to
Of course, it was to be
but you're real on the side.
Now he's getting a lot of people. He'll tell me things I have no idea. It is fascinating. Like my sister-in-law is actually.
Bill's on the
We do have these
side.
like Thanksgiving talks and whatever. It's like,
You just couldn't get to the program in time to sit right. I knew you would be really upset about that, which is why I went to great lengths to keep it this way.
How much they changed
yeah, he would just.
Yeah, so
I'm not a sitter. I said, sure, we don't have to allocate my prices, so they do with all these things. So there's a lot of
and then thinking about other alternative approaches.
Yeah.
I understand what interesting balance.
Hi everyone, if you could sit down, we're gonna start in 2 minutes.
I mean, Croatia now is they're in a different category.
Yeah, they're people level.
Okay. Yeah, but even in Croatia now, a lot of my cousins, they're all either from okay. Because the economic opportunities my wife is tourism.
Yeah.
This balance, everybody. This is it's really good so much food. So much you guys are good. No, just in general. We're not getting as much activity like
Okay, everybody, we're gonna get started. So if you could sit down, and Dehan and Bill will take it away. And sorry, there was a misprint in your program. Bill, if you're you good to go?
Are we ready?
We got this, guys.
Who's drinking a beer back there?
It is Thursday, and I typically teach Thursday nights, so let's get class back in session. All right, my name is Dayon Eskich. I'm a senior fellow here at the University of Utah at the Kempsey Gardner Policy Institute. I work primarily on housing, but have some retail experience. I've been to every grocery store in Florida. I'm originally from the Balkans, so those cannons that you hear in the back as it's Veterans Day, every so often I'll flinch. So if that happens, just understand why. Don't think anything's wrong. It's just one of those days. Love July 4th. Today we're going to talk about single-family rental, and it's like every other day there's some article, something exciting's happening, lots of momentum in that market, and I want to focus mostly on the institutional side. Single-family rentals have been around forever. Roughly a third or so percent of the rental stock is single-family renters. If we look at the national landscape of single-family rentals from the institutional side right now, it is heavily concentrated in this kind of the Sun Belt. It's an easier price entry point. It's much more affordable compared to some of our Western and Intermountain markets. Lots of activity in Phoenix and Texas as well. When we talk about kind of that housing stability that was brought up earlier, I think that there is some evidence that single-family rentals could provide that path to a stable housing environment and wealth creation through some other sort of Wall Street type investor pathways. There is a lot of hype. Okay, if we looked at single-family and in the build for rent space partnerships that have occurred through roughly mid-2021, we've seen it jump up from $9 billion in 2020 to $37 billion in 2021. Okay, just this last few months, there have been roughly $4.5–5 billion worth of new investments and new ventures into this space. So a lot of money is chasing these deals, and as Laurie pointed out earlier in her presentation, the renter household growth for the next 20 years, that's really where it's at. We're going to see a lot of growth. So a lot of demand exists in that space. And part of the reason it's so popular right now too is COVID kind of brought the frenzy to it. You know, we want our own space, but it does bring a product to a rental market where you can form a family and potentially grow a more traditional household. So that's also kind of evident. Where we look at occupancy, so this is from the REIT specifically, you know, it's basically jumped up since the foreclosure crisis worked itself out. And since then, we've been in the 90 range. And as of, 2020 Q2, it's fully occupied. You're at roughly 2% vacancy across the whole nation in these REIT portfolios. So, pretty strong market. Another factor that's very stable, and this is kind of in an inflationary environment, COVID happens to disrupt some real estate assets, a lot less turnover in the single family space, and we see the lowest turnover historically now at roughly about 27%. If we look at investment performance by property sector, so this is looking at all the REITs that are publicly listed, single family for the last 2 years has outperformed every asset class in total returns, with the exception of self-storage. So lots of stability. I think that the key word here is stability in a kind of a hectic real estate environment right now as we're dealing with crazy global environment. Rents are skyrocketing. So here in gray, we have renewal rent hikes percentages, and these are monthly rents. And in the red, we have new lease rent hikes. Up until 2019, 2020 or so, there was a pretty strong even relationship, seasonality in the new lease hikes. But since COVID and since we're in this new environment, these new lease rates have really skyrocketed up. Part of it is supply constraint, but also part of it, especially on the build for rent side, a lot of the portfolios that are sold, they are comped based on their last few leases. They're not comped like in a traditional apartment setting where you look at your whole rent roll. They're more appraised in an environment where you would look at a single family sale, for example. So you would look at your most recent sale. So in that, it generates that realized value up front. So it's a lot more attractive to these institutions. A big factor of this too is, so here in red is American Homes for Rent, and green is Invitation Homes, and this is their monthly per unit NOI going back, 6-7 years. And a lot of that value has been created in the OpEx, the operations optimization. So that's been brought to a stabilized level. And with the rent growth, that's being able to create a lot more value. So the two of these represent 45% of the institutional single-family rent market. So this is pretty evident that you're able to capitalize by you're able to figure out hundreds of thousands of units of how to manage them spread all across the nation, which in itself I think is a pretty impressive feat. So this is the big part, I think, why the money is chasing it, is you have solid cash flow in a pretty stable environment. If we looked at rents, so here on the x-axis are median rents, and each one of these dots represents the purchases of each REIT in 2019 in gray and 2020 in red. What's their median rent? And what is the rent share of the census median household income? And so the national average is roughly at 30%. So overall, they're hitting that arbitrary 30% affordability threshold. But some are hitting up into the 36% range, higher 30s. That's where we've seen a lot of the iBuyers, like the Zillow, the OfferPad. So the Zillow story will work itself out, but you can't day trade homes. So I'll leave that comment there. But we're seeing affordability happening with a lot of these institutions. They're hitting certain affordability thresholds. If we look at circumstances causing single-family renters who would prefer to own instead of renting, so this is a survey from John Burns in April of 2021 of about 1,160 single-family renters. The number one reason they are not able to buy is they need to improve their credit score. So we talked about credit scores earlier. Cannot find a home in a desired location, not earning enough, housing market conditions. So there are a lot of these opportunities from a policy perspective to either figure out how to become a homeowner or to create avenues for that wealth generation aspect of it. Some risks is starting to exist on the ownership side. So, we're in an environment where land is through the roof. Nobody will tell me what land costs are because that's like the holy grail of everything in home building. But our builders, and this is from another survey, our build-for-rent operators outbidding builders on lots and land in your market. And so this is broken out kind of regionally. But in the Southeast, we saw Atlanta, Georgia, that area. 77% of the respondents of the builders said, yeah, we're getting outbid by build-for-rent companies. And on first hand, you kind of think, oh, they're inflating the price, but the way they're valuing their product is kind of that, what is the potential value, not necessarily what the value would be right now. So from their perspective, they're not bidding up the land. To them, it makes sense. So this is my fault because I chose a different font, so things look wonky. But some things looking ahead. So on single-family renters, we're seeing record returns to investors. Future affordability challenges, I think we all agree in this room, they will persist. Another attractive aspect of the build-for-rent single-family market is you can have a detached product in a apartment-type amenity. So whether it's swimming pools, stuff like that, more of HOA traditional amenities, but it does give you a broader amenity package. It's a less resistant path to from a political perspective for rent product. Typically, when we hear about rentals, it's denser. There's all these issues with NIMBYism. And we're going to learn a lot about our cities here in the next few years when more of these built-for-rent communities pop up. So is it about density or is it about those people? And we're going to find out what the truth is, because cities, I feel like, don't have a clue that this is actually happening. That across the Wasatch Front right now, we have over 1,000 units that are in development right now on the built-for-rent side. So, and then are they a path to home ownership? I'll introduce my good friend Bill Goldsmith here, and he's going to share his business model and tell us more.
Yeah, it's my business model. I want to be clear about this. So,
he told me to say that.
Yeah. So my name is Bill Goldsmith. It's not Ben Hellwig. Ben had to go to New York. He'll be here tonight. So if you have more questions about Home Partners, and Ben's one of the founders, he'd be more than happy to entertain those. So what I want to do is lift up a couple items first. So when Home Partners started buying real estate in 2012, there was not an asset class known as single-family rental, right? And when Bill formed Home Partners, it wasn't to build an asset class within single-family rental. Bill's mission was to help people, millions of Americans had lost their homes during the foreclosure crises. So Bill and the early founders, including Ben Hellwig and Sharon Park and John Dowd, wanted to form a way in which people who had lost their home during the foreclosure crises could get back into a single-family lifestyle of their choosing, not of our choosing, but of their choosing, have the opportunity to buy that home, but with no penalty if they did not buy that home. So we started this in 2013. We bought a couple houses in Chicago, Denver, and Dallas. And since then, we just recently bought our 24,000th house. So we're a little over $7 billion in investment. And as of July 2021, we are now officially a Blackstone company. They bought us for $6 billion. And we are now in 80 metro markets around the country. So it's very, very different than trying to build a single-family rental portfolio. It's trying to find ways in which we can help people who currently are not in home ownership, give them a path to get into home ownership. That's our mission. That's our purpose. So let's talk about how it works. It all starts off with a realtor. Our process is all run by the realtor community. We don't market to the public. The realtor community, we have 110,000 agents that are registered with Home Partners. About 8,000 of them have transacted with us. So they identify someone who's looking to rent. They may be looking to buy down the road, but right now they're looking to rent. And so what we do, if you guys have does anyone have an iPhone or a cell phone with you? Okay, if you could open it up, I know y'all do, you're sitting there going like this. So if you could open it up and go to your browser and type in homepartners.com, www.homepartners.com. And when you do that, it's going to look like this. Okay, that's our website. So think of yourself as a consumer who's looking to rent a house in Salt Lake City. So where it says address, I'm going to type in Salt Lake City Metro. And what's going to happen is 709 houses that are currently for sale. Let's keep that in mind. These are not our houses. These are 709 houses that are currently for sale in the Salt Lake City metro area. But you can see next to that, the house that comes up mine is up in Roy. I think it's up near Ogden. And so it's a $420,000 listed house. What we have said to the renter is that if you want us to buy that house, we will for cash. Sellers love that. Agent loves that. And we will charge you $2,670 in rent when you move in. That's it. That's the proposition. You work with the realtor. You go pick out a house that's available for sale. We'll buy it, cash. You just put up a regular security deposit. You move in, and your first year, you're going to pay $2,670 in rent. Make sense? Pretty cool, right? If you think of a renter right now within the real estate community, yes, sir.
That's just really, what's the price of that house? What do you pay for that house?
$420,000.
Thank you.
Yep. It's what comes up. Yep. Okay, so let's press on that house, whatever house you got. And if you scroll down a little bit, you're going to see that the consumer has 3 different opportunities with us. Number one, their only obligation to us is a 1-year lease with a standard security deposit, whatever the security deposit is in that market. At the end of that year, if they decide not to renew that lease, they decide not to buy that house, get their security deposit back, no harm, no foul. They're not walking away from anything. So I said before, no penalty if they decide not to buy. Secondly, they are guaranteed the right to rent that house for up to 5 years. So we're giving them 5 years of rental security in that house, and we're locking in the rent schedule. It's right there on the website. It comes right off of the website, becomes Exhibit A to their lease. And then third, if they want to, they have no requirement to do it. They have no obligation to do it. They have no penalty if they don't want to do it. We're going to give them a pre-agreed upon price by which they could buy that house, which is roughly 5% over our cost compounded annually. So they can go to their lender and say, hey, I've got an offer, a purchase offer to buy this house at this amount. Let's say it's for $430, the house is worth $450. We're still selling it to them for $430. They're walking into $20,000 of equity, and it's their home. Okay, so that's the core program. Now, when we formed this program, we were convinced that the majority of our residents would be moderate income households. That turned out not to be the case. A lot of reasons for that. Taxes are regressive, the cost of maintenance, there's just a limited amount of inventory out there. And so what we want to do now with this new program we're calling Choice Lease is we want to make it more affordable for moderate income households to get into home ownership through lease purchase. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop the rent. You saw the rent in that first page, right? We're going to drop the rent by 10%. So it's a $2,000 rent. We're going to drop it by 10%. That's $200 a month. Times 12, that's $2,400 in their pocket that hopefully they can use for a down payment or closing costs. We're also going to drop the purchase rate by 30%. So remember I said it goes up 5%? In Choice Lease, it's only going to go 3.5%. So by year 4 or 5, they could have an extra $20,000, $25,000 of equity going into that house. The other requirement, I won't get into a lot of detail, is our minimum FICO. We use TransUnion Classic 8 FICO for our core program is 580. For Choice Lease, it's going to be 620. The short answer to that question is we have found over 24,000 houses that we bought. Thousands of families have bought those houses back from us. If they start out at a 620 FICO, they're much more likely to buy it from us. If they start below that, it's much less likely that they'll buy it from us. So again, Choice Lease is about closing the home ownership gap, particularly among households of color. And so we want to give them the best shot at being able to become a homeowner with that house. So this is what it will look like on the website. That's the exact same thing you see on your phone, but if they're Choice Lease approved, which means they're below 80% AMI and a 620 FICO or greater, when they log into our website, they're going to see that rent dropped by 10% all the way down. So over a 5-year period, that's $13,680 savings in rent. And then they're going to see that purchase rate drop by 30%. So that's another $25,000 of equity in their pocket above and beyond the equity they would have earned with the 5% escalator, right? So hopefully this is a way that we can help a lot of Americans get into a house below 80% AMI, the house that they picked out. So think of this, and then I'll close with this thought. This continues to blow me away the most I think about it. You are below 80% AMI. You are not in a position to buy a house. Home Partners comes along and says, well, here's what we're going to do. You go out and pick out your dream house. And by the way, Alanna, a lot of people who are approved FHA are using our program because they are not able to compete in this market right now, right? So you go out, you pick out your dream house, we'll buy it cash. The only thing you're putting up is a security deposit and paying rent. That's all you're doing, just like you would do with any other lease, right? So now you're in your dream home. You've got that right to buy that house at 3.5% over our cost, compounded annually, and you've got that reduced rent. So our goal right now, we're testing in 4 markets. We're in Atlanta, we're in Tampa, we're in Charlotte, and we just opened Phoenix. So we have 95 families that are now in a Choice Lease house. We just opened Phoenix the other day, so that's just kicking in. The average income of our household is $56,000, almost $57,000. Look at the FICO though. These families are amazing, right? They're making $57,000 a year and they're carrying almost a 670 FICO. That's an incredible accomplishment. And then the average house is $228,000. So that's Home Partners of America. That's Choice Lease. We hope to do a lot over the next couple of years to help thousands, literally thousands of moderate income families get into home ownership. Thank you very much. So, open to questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. We got a full 7 minutes.
Bill, a couple of things. One, your Choice Lease program was for those 80% AMI.
Yes.
That's the cutoff.
That's the cutoff.
And the second thing is you guys have had great timing because we've had an appreciating market. What happens when we don't have an appreciating market? How does that work?
Yeah, it's really a great question. And actually, we find our program goes up in popularity when the market becomes less stable, right? Because even for people who could buy, maybe I don't want to buy right now, but I still want to be in that school system. I still want to be in that community. So it's almost like let home partners take the risk. We'll buy it. And if the market ends up rebounding and doing better than 5%, you're in the equity, you can buy the house, if you want. If the market ends up going down, that's our risk. And so you could just stay as a renter up to 5 years or jump out of our house and go find another house. The other very common use of the program, Clark, are military. Military are going to be a place for 2 or 3 years. So they're not looking to buy, right? They're just looking to rent. But this gives them the opportunity to come into, like, Tampa is one of my favorite markets. And so maybe, they're at Fort McDill and they want to be over in Riverside, right? Well, there's no rentals available in Riverside. So this is a great way for them to go over and look at the for sale market, pick out a house, we buy it, they move in, they're there for 3 years, they get redeployed, we take the house back and just rent it out. So there's really a lot of uses for home partners beyond just helping someone become a homeowner. We do accept ITINs, so we have a lot of people who are coming, out of the nation and to work here 2 or 3 years. Another great way for them to use home partners. Yes, Bill.
Bill, at what point is the market too expensive for your model to work?
So we tend to cap ourselves in most markets at 550. I think in Salt Lake City we're at 650, but 550. And the reason for that is because if that first person doesn't buy the house, we're going to get it back. And we want to make sure we're going to be able to re-rent that house and maintain our yield. Now, right now, of course, rents are jumping up like crazy. So maybe we can go up a little bit higher. But that's why we cap ourselves in certain markets to make sure we can maintain our yield if we get the house back. That's a lot harder to do for a $750,000 or an $800,000 house, if that makes sense. Yes, sir.
You said the focus of this is on home ownership. I'm interested in, like, on an annual basis, what percent actually convert?
Well, right now it's skyrocketing, right? So typically, and it's very market specific, to Clark's point, it's, how is house price appreciation doing? But typically over a 5-year horizon, somewhere between 25 and 30% of the folks will end up buying that house from us. I do want to point, as I said before, about 30% of the people who come into our program have no interest in buying the house, right? They are just pure renters. Now that's jumped up to about 10%. And so that, if over 5 years, we could see as much as 50% of the people. And then again, as I said before, if you focus that on households coming in with a FICO of 620 or greater, that number jumps up even more. Yes.
You post both the list price and the monthly rent, but when you go to negotiate the house, do you necessarily pay list price? You might get it for more, you might get it for less. I assume you negotiate that, and then do you adjust the monthly rent? How does that?
That's such a great question. So no, we don't adjust the monthly rent. The rent's the rent, and our, when we do our focus groups, that's really important to people. I need to know what my rent's going to be, but we do adjust the purchase rate. So what happens within 2 to 3 months after they move in, we now have our total basis calculation, in terms of any repairs that we had to do. Then we set 5% over that. So if we paid less, it's less, dollar for dollar. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So BlackRock, I think, is a for-profit company.
So is Blackstone.
Blackstone. So they're a for-profit company.
Yeah.
So what's in it for you? How are you making money by charging less?
It's just rent. I mean, the rent is creating a yield. I can get into the details of the yield. Ben can do even more, but we price our rents at about a 6.1 gross yield. That's just, closer to about, low 5s, high 4s. That's a yield. That's a nice return on a very safe investment, right? Single family rental housing in nice, strong communities is a very safe investment. It's better, I think, than T-bills are paying right now, if I'm not mistaken. And then if they do buy it from us, we have that, that promote happening each year. So it's not a massive return, but when you look at someone like, Blackstone, we fit very nicely within a portion of their portfolio.
The massive return comes because a fairly large percentage doesn't purchase, and they've had appreciation in the last 7 years. So they've been able to hold on to.
From a value perspective, yes, but we do not sell the house.
If I'm at 81% of AMI, I get a higher price, pay a higher rent. If I'm at 79, I pay a lower rent and buy it at a lower price.
Yes.
You must make more profit on it.
So, Herb, that's such a great question. And here's the bet that Blackstone's willing to make. As I said before, if we're going to charge below market rent, no one's going to do that for you, right? No one's going to say, you go pick out the house, we'll buy it, you'll move in and pay below market rent. That makes almost no sense, but that's exactly what we do. We are betting that very few people are going to move out of those houses. So we're going to have a lot better retainage, right? And therefore a lot less turn, which is the most expensive part of managing a portfolio. Also, we think a lot more of those folks are going to buy that house from us because it's at 3.5%. And generally speaking, at least as of now, markets are appreciating way more than 3.5%. So they could be walking into $20,000, $30,000 of equity, and also having paid below market rent. So we think the equity return is actually going to be equal to or maybe even better than our core return because we're charging below market rent. Because we're giving that consumer such a great deal that we think fewer people are going to walk away or not buy the house. Blackstone has the ability to do that. That's a tremendous thing. Yes, Jim.
So one of the differences between the rental market and the ownership market is that if you own the property, you get to do things to it, right?
Yes.
People buy houses because they like working on their house and
yes.
their garden. This is sort of halfway in between. In your leases, who has responsibility for maintenance?
We maintain the house.
If the tenants want to repaint stuff,
they can buy the house.
Oh wow!
And you know all the reasons for that, right? Yeah, you think you can do it, but you really can't. So let's wait till you buy the house, and then you can do what you want. Great site though. Yes, sir.
So this is going to be a follow-up on Chris's question. So if I'm a potential buyer,
yes.
The reason I want to know the yield I was getting was 7.5% for those that are not in the under 80 program, which is much higher than I think is typical if you look at rent versus price in most markets right now. So if I have a choice between, if I'm able to save money
yep.
for 3 years and pay rent to somebody
yep.
and then buy a house, am I better off or worse off than if I go through your program?
I think you're always better off buying the real estate if you're in a position to buy the real estate. And I'm a realtor myself too, and that's always my recommendation is if you're in a position to buy the house, you should buy the house, right? But if you're not in position, and I think Laurie would lift up, down payment is a very big barrier for a lot of people to be able to buy the house. Go back to the FHA.
I put my money instead of effectively, I'm giving you some equity, which is leading you to give them equity back later. What if I just have the discipline, put it in a Vanguard fund for 3 years? And then that whatever that differential is, because there's got to be a differential rent between your rent and what market rent.
Yeah, I've never done the modeling, but it sounds like an interesting point. Having said that, a lot of reasons why people want that house at this time is more than just, because I'm trying to maximize my return on my capital, right? So I want my kids in that school. You get back to the Chetty studies, right? I want my kids in that school. I want to test drive this community. Is this really where I want to live? If I buy a house, I'm in. Doesn't matter whether I end up wanting to live there. So I get to test drive my neighbors. I get to test drive the school. I get to test drive the house. So there's a lot of advantages to the lease purchase model, but you're absolutely right. It's not for everyone. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you could speak to that last point you just made. When a household is thinking about where they might, which unit they're interested in, do you all ever kind of consult with them about different opportunities or different options?
So that's the realtor's job. So we never, ever, ever buy real estate without a realtor involved. So it's the realtor who is running her marketing program. and whether they're using Facebook or Google AdWords or whatever they're doing, and they got a lead of someone who either can't or doesn't want to buy right now, but they want to be in a certain community. So that realtor now is treating that person who generally they probably wouldn't pay much attention to, because the commissions on a rental are usually anywhere between a half month's rent and $150. Now they're looking at a $9,000 commission. So that person all of a sudden becomes very valuable to them, and they essentially are a cash buyer.
So, okay, well, I'll just say that I think it's interesting to think about this as a program for increasing the rental supply in kind of high SES areas. Because that seems to me like a really big deal that you do that.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if, there's powers of habit, and I don't know if the realtors are able to really, I'd be interested in knowing if people's locations change as a result of this.
Yeah. Yes. I think we need to close up here.
Yeah, would your model ever work? Let's say you have 2 domestic violence, single women, 1 child. Would your model ever work if they wanted to join together?
You can have up to 3 unrelated people in the house. And there's a broad spectrum of folks who use our program because they are going through a high domestic distress situation. Divorce is a very big part of a lot of our users. I'm not going to be able to buy for the next couple of years whether I want to or not, but I want to keep my kids in the school. I want to create stability for them. They got that 5-year rent horizon. So I don't like to get in those details, but that's a very big user of our program, are people going through a lot of domestic issues. Yes, sir.
Your tenants maintain their purchase rights if they miss a payment or are late on rent?
So if they're evicted, no, but we don't do evictions.
What if they just miss a payment?
No, the purchase right's a purchase right. They're 2 different agreements. So how they perform on the lease has no impact on the purchase right at all. So as long as they remain a resident in there. Now, if they owe us back rent, they need to pay it at the closing table, right?
Sure.
But, and remember, they have a 2-month security deposit too that they can use towards their closing. So, that's a little down payment assistance right there. So, but no, they're 2 separate agreements.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Thanks so much for
It's a very cool model.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to bring up our next panel, so we have Andra up on stage to do that.
That's great.
Great, that was really interesting. Okay, so we've had a lot of discussions about market rate housing, and particularly about supply restrictions. Land matters, but there's a certain fraction of the population that you could give away the land and you still can't build new housing anywhere close to what is affordable. And even though we think filtering is the main source of housing for these folks, the filtering process doesn't seem to be working fast enough either. And so we do have some government support for it, and the main supply side program is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. We have 3 specialists on the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. Mike Erickson is going to give you a bit of an overview first, as well as talk about at least one of the goals of LIHTC being to increase the number of affordable units. Then we're going to bring out our own Nate Siegert, and Nate Siegert's actually looking at maybe what you might consider mission creep in the LIHTC mission to kind of expand housing options in opportunity neighborhoods, so inclusive communities, which is a slightly different goal than just the number of affordable units. And then Adam is going to talk about his experience on the policy side when he was in DC. So they're going to give you their overview of the program, and then what's going to happen is they're all going to come up with constructive solutions for how they would improve the program, right? So this is a national program, but it is administered by state agencies, and so hopefully we can come up with some specific suggestions. So Mike Erickson is also academic director of the Real Estate Center at University of Cincinnati. Again, he's got several papers looking at LIHTC. He's also got a lot of papers looking at construction costs, which is one of the few economists that actually looks at physical construction costs. So I'm really, really happy he's here, and I will turn it over to Mike.
Great. Thank you very much just for being here. This was really a unique conversation when Andra brought it up. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit really does have a special place in kind of American policy there's really probably few programs out there that really address the supply side of the real estate kind of rental like the market, right? We've talked a lot about homeownership today. If we talk about basically rental housing subsidies, we spend about $7 billion a year, or sorry, $60 billion a year on 7 million like subsidies. So this program started in the Tax Reform Act of 1986. Since subsidized about 3 million units like nationwide. And it really costs us about $14 billion a year of loss, like the tax. And the way to think about loss tax, like the revenue is, this isn't an expenditure you think of HUD, right? We think about Section 8 vouchers. What's unique about this program is it's really embedded within the tax code, Section 42 of the tax code. And the basic idea here is that developers are going to receive a tax credit equal to 117% of their non-land, like the non-land costs. So this is a voluntary program. They have to apply for this program. And then from there, they have to impose basically a maximum kind of rent and income restrictions on these units for 15 to 30 years. As I said, they must apply to the state allocating authority in Utah. It's the Utah Housing Corporation. Anybody from the Utah Housing Corporation here? I saw someone. So you guys might be more the expert than me about
up on tomatoes and cabbage, right?
Sounds great. So as I said, I mean, the way to think about this program is it's in the tax code. It's a tax kind of expenditure. Every state runs it slightly different, right? And I think this is one of the things where you find some states do an excellent job, like Utah, of course. Other states, as I said, there's a lot of kind of like the heterogeneity that you really see with this program. But to give you kind of context, about 7 million is like the subsidies. Tax credits, about 3 million of these. Housing choice vouchers, about 2.5 million nationwide. Public housing, we still have about 1 million of these units that we're still, that are occupied. And then other kind of rental housing assistance programs are about 1.4 million. So this is the largest program. Now, some of these units are starting to kind of time off. And I think that's an important part of this context of what do we do these units after that time period. Goal today, talk a little bit about the program. There's actually 2 separate programs that we would kind of call low-income housing tax credit. I want to kind of overview what that means. Then talk about Salt Lake, like this city and really the whole entire like the Utah area. Talk about kind of what do these rents mean, who's targeted, what would a developer look like if you're actually going for this, and then we'll talk a little bit about basically some recent research, but I'll probably hold off that more to the conversation at the end. So if you've heard about the program, there's really 2 main variants. There's kind of a non-competitive, which has been called the 4% program. And there's a lot of reasons why it's called the 4% program. It's actually now really a 4% program. But the idea with this is developers receive up to 52% of their costs through tax credits over the next 10 years. It's a 10-year, and accordingly, they said a max tenant rent or a max tenant income of 60% AMI. So HUD published these for each kind of fair market rent area. And then the maximum tenant rent of these units, again, this is the it's 18% of the AMI. And the idea there is that somebody who's earning exactly 60% AMI, spending 30% of their income. So again, it's very like a formulaic. What's important is it's independent of actually how much income the person actually has that's residing there, unless there's a voucher or some other like this subsidy. Also with this is they could be less substantial and also kind of use federal income tax bonds to finance property. So many layers of subsidy with these competitive. If you look at the rent and income limits, this is 60% AMI. Again, we always talk about AMI, kind of the low income standards. Salt Lake City, if we would look at a 3-person max, this would be about $44,280 a year. And what's important for the tax code as well is it defines basically 1.5 persons per bedroom. So when we talk about a 2-bedroom unit, they assume 3 people are going to live there. So the 3-person AMI sets that rent. Again, it could be 2 people live there, could be 4 people, right? But the rent there is going to be $1,245. This is 2021. In Salt Lake City, the median rent was just over almost $1,300 like the dollar. So about a $50 gap is what you see of this. They're close. And again, this is the 60% AMI. If we go to Ogden, right, the incomes are closer, right, to Salt Lake City, $43,500. So the 2-bedroom rents are pretty similar as well. But you get the medium 2-bed rents in this case of about $300 less, right? So what's important here is the max tax credit rent actually exceeds the median rent in Ogden. Now, if you look at Park City, obviously the incomes are higher. So someone up to almost 65,000 could live in one of these units. And so the tax credit rent is almost over $1,600 a month. And the median rent there is about $1,300. So you get this large kind of gap. And I think the important thing is, at least with this, is they're not always binding, right? So it could be we're building really nice units and they are able to charge the full 1614. Realistically, they're probably charging a lower amount because it's closer to market, but we're giving a large subsidy for this as well. So now what you've probably heard of is more of the competitive program. This is also called the 9% program, which has really been true since 2008. And the idea here is developers can receive tax credits up to 117% of their construction costs. So more than $1 for every dollar of cost at the margin, but does not subsidize land, which is an important part of this program. What's important though is that states are limited in their as far as their allocations based on state population. So due to what we just heard about the infrastructure bill, in 2022 it would be about $31.40 per person in Utah we could allocate through this program. In most states, I'm pretty sure Utah's this way, there's more just requested for every. So there's a bidding process. These developers usually hire a consultant, and developers voluntarily lower as far as the max tenant incomes and rents. So there's some sort of competition. They get about double the subsidy, but again, they're bidding down the max rents below that 6% AMI that I showed on the previous page. So if you look nationwide as far as these units, again, this is from as far as HUD. This is their, they have great data. And what you generally see right here is, again, about 3 million units nationwide. The red shows you as far as the competitive, and the blue is the non. About 58% of the US is these kind of more or less like the more generous subsidy. The black line shows you the inflation adjusted, as far as the allocations from the National Council of State Housing, Agencies. And again, that's inflation adjusted, so it's been increasing, but you see the units decreasing. And kind of one story there, of course, is the costs per unit are increasing more than as far as like the CPI. So that's where you sort of get that. In 2019, we allocated nationwide 65,000 units. That's down from a high of really almost 120,000 up here, and we spent about $11.2 billion in the competitive program. Another about $3 billion, we think. It should be increasing, we think, but of the so that's how I get about that $4 billion estimate. What's important about this program, though, is it's by state population, right? So it's not by need necessarily. So what you see in this graph is, so on the x-axis is the housing affordability gap. Richard Green, who gave me a plug earlier, I give you credit, about 2011, you had this great article with explaining of how do we think about affordability. You always do the 30%, 40% kind of the standard. What's a great way to look is if somebody's doing exactly 60% as far as AMI, how much will it cost for them to afford, let's say, a median? So if you would look at Salt Lake City, which is just kind of in the middle, right, it's pretty close to zero, right? If we look at basically what rents are, right, we're relatively, slightly kind of unaffordable based on of the 100 largest metropolitan areas. The #1 metro area in the country is Jackson, Mississippi. Right now has the most at over 1,750 tax rate units per capita. You kind of see over here then what we tend to think of the Boston, the San Francisco, right? We get less than average. And again, the simple story there is it costs more to build in those cities, right? And Jackson's pretty cheap to build, but they get the same number of units as far as the residents. If we did, let's say, a regression based upon this housing affordability gap, or again, anything basically to the left of this line is like tax rate rents are above as far as the median. Everything to the right is kind of unaffordable, where San Jose is the least affordable. We get an R-squared of less than 0.01, which is not a good fit. So basically, we have these units, but they're not necessarily where we need or we think housing is kind of unaffordable. If we look at Utah, there's altogether about 25,000 of these units across Utah as we have it. Again, this is from the HUD, like the database. Kind of more reliance in the competitive side of the program for Utah. There's about $99 million of allocations in 2019. but only built 687 units in Utah. So the subsidy in Utah for 2019 was about $144,000 per unit of tax credits. Now again, we allocate these over like as far as like the 10 years. So we gotta think about some discount rates there. But as you see, right, generally it's a relatively high, the idea that we're gonna solve the state's housing affordability problems with only the low-income housing tax credit with 687 units a year is probably ambitious, right? And I think people generally tend to view this, that really this has to be a complementarity of other policies. So what would a program look like in Salt Lake? A developer, let's say, gets a competitive, they apply. They have 50 units at $200,000 per unit, again, in these costs. And we're gonna say this is in kerns, this is a qualified census tract. So they get what's called this basis boost. So it costs them $10 million, but we actually multiply that by 30%. So this developer for $10 million would actually get over $1 million a year in tax credits as far as an annuity. Now, what's important about this is the tax credits they're only valuable if you have a tax liability. And we know due to the tax code, generally we have due to depreciation allowances, these firms never actually have any tax as far as liability. 40% are also kind of a nonprofit as well. So as we think about what's going on with this, right, we're giving a very sizable subsidy that's worthless to the projects. So they all sell it to outside, some sort of like a PNC Bank is a big investor of this, or Stephen Ross, right? And what's important here is they're bidding for the equity of the projects with the tax credits. Now they have a tax liability for the next 10 years. But they also get passive kind of taxable losses, residual cash flows. More importantly, somebody gets what this property is worth at the end of 15 years or 30 years, whenever kind of the affordability goes, right? We tend to calculate RRs without that kind of residual cash flows, and there's passive taxable losses. But that investor is responsible just to make sure that they abide, as far as by the guidelines, or they get about a 1/3 like a penalty plus interest. But that's only for 15 years, right? At year 18, they might lose reputation, not getting their subsidy, but there's no financial penalty if after 15 years or really 17 years, they say, we appreciate this, the market's appreciated a lot, or more likely, this property is really depreciated so much, we can't keep the lights on anymore, right? So then there's kind of various things happen. What this outside investor, though, would pay, let's say if they have a 5% discount rate just for the tax credits, they would pay about $9 million for the equity of this project. And this is when you hear people talk about, well, they're on average paying $77 for $1 tax credit, right? That's what they're talking about, right? And it could be higher by using a different discount rate, let's say, or once we factor in, let's say, some of these passive taxable losses or CRA, there's usually some other benefits for these investors as well. So I won't spend too much time talking about as far as the research. The most important kind of summary of the research is we have to build what private market doesn't build. Right? So there's a good potential, if we're truly hitting that 60% AMI mark, these aren't new households, most likely, right? In places like Cincinnati, these households probably would have lived somewhere else in the city. There's not really excess demand for housing in Cincinnati, right? That's something that's going away from the private market. We call that crowd out. We also find that, to the program's credit, we build a lot of units. We generally increase the quality of housing consumed, potential for better neighborhoods as well. But there's some positive and negative externalities as well. So kind of things to be thinking of the trade-offs, right? We're gonna hear a lot more from the other speakers today. Punchline is, right, this is very important, like it's a subsidy. It's hard to ignore the number of units that it's built. We just don't know if these are net new, as far as the units. This is a pretty large subsidy. Encourages, you could argue, developers to at least not cost minimize, which I think is fair. And at the same time, at the end of the day, I think hopefully as we're discussed, right, you really have to be conscious of what you're subsidizing. And there really is opportunity to build something that they never would. Single room occupancy or housing with services. There's a lot of categories that a private market would never do. And that's sort of the low hanging fruit of this program. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. And our next speaker is Nate Seeker, who's going to talk to about some of his research specifically on the effects of the Utah program. I also forgot to mention, we are going to allow at least 15 minutes, well, at least 10 minutes, preferably 15 for questions. So I do want to make sure we have a chance to hear from the audience on this particular issue. Go ahead.
Yeah, great. We really do want lots of feedback and comments and make this lively. It's the end of the day, right? So this is good. So, you know, a lot of things that have been said, I think it's been super interesting. And I think when we think about housing, the reason that I started this project was to think through, you know, what are the market failures? We've heard people say, well, there's a market failure. Even what Mike was saying was, well, if the market's not building it, then maybe we should step in. And I think I just want to step back and just say why, but I'll let you answer that for yourselves. One of the things that we wanted to do was look at, okay, what are the goals of the LIHTC program? Like, what are we trying to accomplish? And then are we hitting those marks? Okay, so it doesn't seem too ambitious, does it? But like to Jenny's point earlier, which I think I really want to just highlight, we do need more of this program evaluation. We need more just looking at, try things out, see if they work, see if they don't work. I think that's very important in this space, but I think it's also very difficult because if you have a policy change, the whole neighborhood, the whole dynamics of your city isn't going to change overnight. It's going to take you 30 years to even see some of these changes, okay? So I walk in, LIHTC's been around, luckily for over 30 years, so we can look at some of these changes. But I think, you know, while we need some of this program evaluation, we should also recognize that these things might take a very long time to look at. Okay, so what is the goal, or what is one of the goals of this program? So even though HUD does not organize or oversee LIHTC, I think there was a sense from a housing perspective, like what does LIHTC as a tool bring to the table that other programs that we've been using didn't have. And I think it's summarized here by this HUD quote, which was, several recent housing policy initiatives have been aimed at reducing the spatial concentration of very poor households, right? And hence the economic diversity of LIHTC properties and their contribution to economic diversity in the neighborhood are important policy issues. And so I think that was one of the, I think, big promises of LIHTC was we were going to be able to put these affordable housing units in places that otherwise they wouldn't be, right? With some sort of goal, some sort of understanding that the diversity of income within a neighborhood would increase. Okay, I think that was sort of one of the big goals, as opposed to building a lot of public housing, which had been a policy previously, right? So what we're going to do in this project is just look at, well, has income diversity, take your favorite measure, maybe the standard deviation of income in a neighborhood, has that increased or decreased as a result of this program? Okay, so the first thing you do when you start a project is you get a bunch of undergrad RAs and you have them just go look at stuff. And so what we did was we looked at all of the LIHTC projects in Utah, and I had them use the Wayback Machine to go look at what was there before the LIHTC project, okay? And then look at what's there after the LIHTC project, okay? And so we did this on every single project that I think that we had data on and then we could find in Google View. And you saw a lot of, this is a very typical example, right? This house is probably not renting for very well, right, in the neighborhood, and you're seeing some of the changes that are occurring. Afterwards, you can kind of see the changes that are happening in the neighborhood as well. And so we're interested in that question. What's happening to the neighborhoods, and is it increasing this income diversity? Now, the hard part with that, right, would be that developers don't choose these locations randomly, right? I've asked developers to just do things randomly for me. They don't. I've asked policymakers to do this as well, right? And so what we were able to do in Utah, and then expand this a little bit to the nation, was we looked at where projects were proposed, and then we looked at the winners, the people who just got the projects, versus those who just didn't get the projects, right? And we think that's a very good sort of treatment and control group, because developers are all saying these are good places for this type of development. Okay, so then we're just going to look at neighborhoods, which if you're a policy wonk, this is technically a census block group. That's what I'm going to look at. I'm just going to call them neighborhoods. So we're going to look at the neighborhoods before and after over this long 30-year period, looking at again, a neighborhood with a bunch of projects that were accepted versus projects that were proposed but were rejected for one reason or another, okay? And so what you should be thinking to yourself is, okay, did income diversity go up or did it go down? And then the next level question, yes?
4 and 9, or is this exclusively 9?
This is both 4 and 9. Yeah, it's a good question. We have looked at sort of splitting this out a little bit, but what I'm going to show you here is 4 and 9. Very good. The second level question, which I think is also very interesting, which is, okay, so where then in the income distribution are you seeing the biggest changes due to this program, right? And one of the stories you hear, right, I think it's good to look at the data and not go off of the stories, but one of the stories you hear is that one of these developments come in and then the richest people in the neighborhood leave. Now, just from this, I don't know that that's what I would expect given what I saw on Google View, but that is definitely one of the stories. And so then you might think that income diversity decreased because the top of the income distribution was less represented in those neighborhoods. Okay? Alternatively, you could think, well, we're putting these affordable housing units in higher income neighborhoods where they wouldn't be otherwise. And so we're going to see an increase in representation of the lowest income groups. Okay? So the question is, what did we find? What we found is that income diversity decreased in these neighborhoods that received these LIHTC projects. And I think at first this was not what we expected at all. And then given the story that I sort of told you, I expected that these changes, if we had seen a decrease in diversity of income, that we would have seen a big negative shock to the representation of sort of the richest people in the neighborhood. That's not what we see. We see the decrease in income diversity because now the lowest income individuals are less represented in the neighborhood, okay? When I talk to policymakers, when I talk to developers, at first, sometimes they'll say, yeah, that was not what I expected. And then they're like, yeah, but maybe it is, right? Because, as Mike was pointing out, 60% AMI really still leaves out a lot of low-income households, right? And so whether this is directly limiting and replacing sort of household places where the lowest income people lived, or just sort of changing the neighborhood in a way that's pricing them out, or just adding more people that are but are not representative of this lower income group, I think are all three things that we're still digging into right now. Okay, so I have some retooling ideas, but I'll leave that for later.
Great. Adam. Oh, there he is.
Thanks very much. I'm going to speak from the podium if nobody else minds. It is great to be here again in person. This is not the first time I've worn a suit jacket to a conference, but it's the first time I've put on the matching pants. So it's good to be back to normal. And so before I start, I just wanted to say that this panel was initially conceived as a debate over the question of whether LIHTC has lived up to its promise. And I think I was cast as the dissenting voice. And so just with that in mind, I want to say from the outset that I am not a bad person. I just play one at economics conferences. So
we'll be the judge of that.
Yes, we'll find out. So since its creation, LIHTC has had several economic goals, and it's had political goals. The ostensible economic goals of LIHTC are to increase the supply of housing and to improve the lives of low-income Americans. And so clearly, as Nate has alluded, people have subsequently suggested that there are broader goals promoting diversity, facilitating economic opportunity, redeveloping communities, helping to pay for other social services like the difficult to house, dealing with difficult to house populations. But I'd say its core economic goals are to increase the supply of housing and to make low-income Americans better off. And then there's also political goals, and I do think it's important to remember why this credit exists. It was enacted as a political compromise to help get the Tax Reform Act of 1986 over the line. TR 86 was about to hammer the real estate industry. It repealed accelerated depreciation, it jacked up the capital gains tax rate, it eliminated passive losses, and so the chip that was played to get the real estate industry back on board was in part to enact the low-income housing tax credit. And the idea was to provide something that implement something that provides sustained popular support for real estate interests. And so lest you think I have nothing positive to say about the low-income housing tax credit, I'll point out that it is in fact incredibly politically popular. So on its economic goals, the evidence suggests that it's surprisingly ineffective at its key economic goals. First, there is very little evidence that the low-income housing tax credit actually increases the supply of low-income housing units. Obviously, the credit subsidizes tens of thousands of units every year, and has subsidized 3 million units since its creation. But the number of subsidized units is not the same as the number of new units, because many of those units might have been built anyway in some form or another, even in the absence of the subsidy. And in fact, a large body of empirical economic research has tried to understand exactly of the total number of subsidized units, how many would not have been built in the absence of the subsidy. In other words, it tries to ask how much did the total number of units of housing go up because of the low-income housing tax credit. And so this research, for example, carefully compares the number of housing units in a neighborhood before and after housing credits were available in that area, or before and after credits were awarded to a neighborhood, or before and after a census tract qualified for enhanced subsidies, or they compared qualifying areas to similar, adjacent, but not qualifying areas. And you'd think that if LIHTC boosted the supply of housing, that the number of units of housing would go up in the areas that receive the subsidy. But it doesn't, certainly not at least one for one with the number of subsidized units. Some estimates suggest that there is no increase in the number of units, and I will say that a key citation in the literature is from a guy who's sitting right there. Another published paper suggests, for every 5 subsidized units, 1 is new. And then there are other papers that have higher ranges, particularly in certain cases of stagnant or declining areas. It does seem to have an increase in the supply, but it's never equal to the number of subsidized units. And so in other words, the program seems to encourage investors to substitute non-subsidized housing for subsidized housing. And that means the program ends up subsidizing a lot of units that would have been built anyway. That might sound surprising, but in many areas, especially high-cost areas where housing is unaffordable, the supply of housing is largely determined by regulation, by the supply of buildable land, by the capacity of the construction sector. And so if the number of new units is fixed largely by these supply constraints, then when LIHTC comes in and offers to pay for 130% of the cost basis of a building that you were going to build anyway, then yeah, you take the money. And beyond the implications for the efficacy of the program, the fact that supply in high-cost areas is inelastic has some other implications. One is that the program is incredibly expensive on a per new unit basis. So for example, if, as Mike said in his presentation, that each subsidized unit costs $200,000, if only 1 out of 5 units is new, that means that each new unit costs $1 million. And that's a really expensive way to help poor people, especially as I'm about to argue, when the residents of those apartments pay rents that are pretty close to market rent. Second, as I taught just last week in my introductory economics class, the inelastic factor bears the tax and bears the burden of the tax and benefits from the subsidy. And so what that means is that when the supply of housing is inelastic, the primary beneficiaries of housing subsidies, whether they're LIHTC or home ownership incentives or housing vouchers, are the landowners in the real estate industry rather than the residents of those communities. That might be surprising too. There are clearly rules that cap rents charged in low-income housing. The residents are required to meet income eligibility rules. You'd think that that would mean that the rents charged would be below market rents and that the residents themselves would benefit. But that doesn't always seem to be true. One reason is that LIHTC developments are disproportionately located in poor, segregated, undesirable locations of otherwise higher cost metropolitan areas. Those areas are easier to build in, there's less resistance from the community, and typical incomes and market rents in those neighborhoods are often so low that the LIHTC limits don't matter. So I used to live in Washington, D.C. Area median income in Washington, D.C. is $129,000. That's because it has places like Georgetown and Bethesda and Arlington in the metropolitan area. That means that a three-person family can earn $69,000 and live in low-income housing. They would pay a qualifying rent of up to $1,700 a month, basically. But if you zoom into the Anacostia neighborhood on the other side of the Potomac River, well, median family income in that neighborhood is $39,000. Median rent for a two-bedroom apartment at market rates is $1,400. So if you build in Anacostia, you can charge above market rates to families with above average incomes, and the tax credit will pay for 130% of the basis of your construction because it's a qualified census tract. And guess what? More than half of low-income housing in DC is built in Anacostia. And so that's not just a failure to direct the subsidy to the residents where it's needed. It's a failure that has implications for the well-being of the residents, their children, and their neighbors. Today, about a third of new LIHTC housing recently placed in service was built in areas where the neighborhood poverty rate exceeds 30%. For comparison, about 15% of all rental units are in such high poverty neighborhoods, which means that a LIHTC unit is twice as likely to be built in a high poverty area than is a regular apartment. And it's even less likely to be built in very low poverty areas. And likewise, if you look at new multi-bedroom units financed by LIHTC, which are built basically for families with children, they are primarily built in school districts with the worst student outcomes based on things like test scores or graduation rates. And then likewise, we've alluded to the evidence about economic opportunity. Today we have access to these huge administrative data sets that allow us to measure economic opportunity at very fine geographic areas to identify places where children grow up to be successful, above average earning adults, or instead end up with rates of incarceration that exceed rates of college going, where people struggle to find jobs, where teens have, where teen childbearing is high. And it turns out that a large share of our LIHTC subsidized housing is built in kind of opportunity wastelands, places where kids kind of have very low likelihoods of growing up to be successful adults. So in those regards, I think the program has not met its economic promise. On the other hand, it has clearly achieved its political goals. I was going to include, but I did not include a slide that was a collage of dozens of photos of ribbon cuttings. The ones where like smiling mayor stands in front of a ribbon, sharing a giant pair of scissors with a developer and an advocate under a banner that announces affordable housing. And so it is very effective at producing photo opportunities like that. It subsidizes, as they said, 3 million units over time. And so in every community, in every city in the country, there's the opportunity to do this. So I don't think the program's going away anytime soon, but I'm hopeful that we can improve on it. Thank you.
On those cheery notes, I'm going to turn it over to Mike to come up with some constructive suggestions for how we can best improve LIHTC.
So I used to be like Adam, is a good way to describe it. And we're all kind of economists, and I think it brought up earlier. I think any economist, we really prefer a kind of a cash transfer. But again, there's politics involved. I think, I'm probably of the field that says, a housing voucher first policy, and especially if we reform some land That tends to probably work in at least 90% of the markets, that situations. But I think from a state policy perspective, right, this is $100 million a year you're able to allocate to your developers. You might as well make the most of it, right? This is part of the tax code, as Adam said, it's really not going away. So what I would do, and I have really 10 ideas, but I think we all want to at some point leave today. So I'm going to focus on 3. The first one's kind of more pie on the sky. It ignores the politics of it. But basically, right now we do a state population allocation. Again, Jackson, Mississippi has the most. Honolulu has some of the least, right? And one of the easiest ways is we talk about reforms. We don't just do a pure formulaic state population. We at least index it somehow to need, right? And we could think about how to do that. We also could maybe target and say, hey, look, we're going to have a special allocation for the very, very low income 30% AMI, which, by the way, kind of to the point, a lot of these units do end up in that category, which is important, right? To targeting the lowest, but they need vouchers, they need other kind of subsidies as well. And I think that's sort of one of the ways to think about we could do more with what we have, right? We need to think about this kind of crowd out effect. And really do something different, right? In my view, I would do these inelastically supplied metro areas, which we talked about. And then I think we talked about demand. I can't say I'm comfortable with thought about this much more, but by building more affordable housing in Cincinnati, Ohio, nobody's ever not moved to Cincinnati and said, you know what, it's too unaffordable, right? So we're really taking somebody from the private market, right, versus let's say Los Angeles, where maybe we could build 30,000 more units, and there's still that people that would move there once we adjust that, right? So thinking of that crowd effect, I think really differs. It's along those lines. The second reform I would do is there's really unnecessary risk for tax credit investors. So I wrote this paper in 2009. We really looked at these risks for investors. And the easiest one to me, the lowest hanging fruit, is refundability. So Fannie Mae invested in a lot of these. They were the primary kind of investor in the 2000s of these. Once 2008 hit, their portfolio went to 0, right? They tried to sell it. That really impacted, I think, the price of the market going forward because you might have a great future tax liability, but you never know what might happen, right? Furthermore, I think what's important as well is if we actually made these as far as refundable, we could actually have some of these projects self-finance. So instead of having to go to a private market investor with probably a relatively high cost of capital, right, we could think ahead and say, okay, well, if we did this over 5 years or even 1 year, right, after place in service, we could actually use that just to repay the construction debt, right? And actually, in some sense, use that where there never is that debt on that property or the permanent debt that would otherwise be there. And I really think these are the kind of low-hanging fruits. It's the last one I think is really kind of the theme of this conference. Is really at the margin, right? We don't incentivize, the developers to cut costs or to innovate how to cut costs, right? We basically build housing today really similar as we did 50 years ago, 60 years ago, right? Especially multifamily housing. We just haven't had the innovation that we've had somewhat in the single family homes, right? So one of the things that happens here is developers receive a 9% fee on these projects, and the more expensive they make that project, or the more unique butterfly, I like to say, with expensive architecture design costs that increase the costs, the more their fees go up, right? The more their returns. So, one of my things is we could try to fix costs, and I think that's actually easier said than done. But what we could do is we could fix these fees. And if we fix these fees, and I'm not saying keep them low, but keep them at the median for the state, then you reward the developers that are going out there, they're innovating, and they get to help capture that rent. And maybe we go one step further where maybe they have to kind of explain what some of these innovations are, right? They can educate the next crop, and we reward through the qualified allocation plans these innovative developers that are doing more with less, right? And I think as soon as we do that right, again, I think we're in maybe a third best situation with the tax credit program. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to turn away $100 million to build affordable housing. And I think this is a way just to get more there. So thank you.
Okay, so despite maybe thinking that we're all very negative on LIHTC, I actually think I'm very much the other way. I think it obviously does work. Developers do change their behavior, their development to obtain these credits. And I think what we need to do is maybe recalibrate it, maybe provide more subsidies, depending on what it is our goals are with this program. Okay, so what I was trying to show, what the evidence says is maybe it's not helping the lowest income households. Now, is that our goal or not? And if it is, then we just need to recalibrate this. You know, some of the things that you should think about LIHTC also is it's in a whole environment of housing, right? So in Utah, you get extra points for your development if you're in a high income area. This is, you know, part of the formula that, you know, very smart people, I'm just pointing to James Wood, who I think is one of those very smart people, help sort of develop to make this work. But it turns out people in high income neighborhoods have a lot of NIMBYism and don't allow sort of those projects. So I don't think it's LIHTC's fault, I guess, that that didn't happen, because in fact, the policy is set up to actually encourage that sort of development. So I think there's just some sort of tweaking and recalibration and maybe even expanding of LIHTC to really get more of this happening, right? If you want to help individuals at 30% AMI, you're going to have to increase the subsidy of doing that, right? And if that's your goal, then we can do that, right? Because we are seeing that we do see movement from the tax credit. And so the question is just to kind of reevaluate what are our goals with this program, and then how can we calibrate these different tax credits to achieve those goals. Like another one that I think is, you know, interesting that Adam and other people often bring up, somehow that housing policy is supposed to fix the school system, I think is very interesting. If you think there's a bad school, maybe we should fix the bad school. But I think that's important, just thinking about what it is our goals of the housing policy is and what it can and cannot do. Here, I'll turn it over to you.
I don't need those slides.
I don't need a slide. We're not on the slides, right?
Yeah, we're not.
Okay. I mean, so trying to be constructive here, because I guess the first thing to say is that I feel like the elephant in the room in affordable housing is the fact that the supply of housing is inelastic, and when you can't build anything, or it's very hard to build in particular places, especially places where people want to live and where rents are rising and affordability is falling. It doesn't make sense to spend additional money on subsidies in those areas unless it's contingent on making changes in on the supply side. And so what I mean is that we should try to devote our spending dollars to places where the supply is elastic, where our subsidies will have a large effect on housing, or we should make them contingent on cities making changes that increase the supply of housing. And so, you know, I could refer back to Jenny's slide about what states can do to encourage, you know, preemption or what was the phrase? Builders' rights and you know, provisions that allow not just for the building of low-income housing, but for building more housing in general. And I think that if we made changes that made changes to the program that encouraged state and local governments to increase the supply of housing, I think that'd be beneficial to the program. I also think that if states, if they were contingent on those types of things, and states did not adopt changes that increased the supply of housing or directed funding to places where housing was more elastic, then I think that'd be fine too, because it would mean that we wouldn't be using the money in places where it was ineffective and being wasted. So that is a broad category of ideas of like, use the money where it can have an effect and don't use it in places where its effect will be captured by existing landowners, developers, places where it won't increase the supply of housing much. The second thing is to target it more narrowly. You know, we're trying to get to increase the supply of housing that wouldn't be supplied anyway, and 60% of AMI is high in a lot of neighborhoods, certainly in cities at large, but particularly within cities. There are a lot of neighborhoods where 60% AMI represents a large fraction of the population. I mentioned Acosta, but it's probably true. I think it's true in just about every city that there are pockets of places where it's effectively a market rent. In contrast, the people who I think struggle the most with housing are, you know, below 30% of AMI, people who have no income. And even low-income housing is not affordable at the LIHTC rents. And so I think making the program more targeted based on income is another example of how it could be improved. The third thing I'll mention is using it as a tool of economic opportunity. Right now, builders and states have wide latitude to choose where these projects go. They don't always have the long-term interests of the residents in mind when they make those choices. We know today that neighborhoods vary dramatically, not just in the things that are measurable like the quality of their schools, but these kind of unobservable characteristics that help children succeed in life. Some cities are using information about economic opportunity and concentration of poverty in their qualified action plans to when developers apply for LIHTC to prioritize projects that intend to locate in high opportunity areas. But it's not a requirement that occurs everywhere, and it's not something that's prioritized in all states. And it's something that I think states and the federal government could ask of developers when they're using the low-income housing tax credit.
Thanks. Before I turn it over to the audience, I just want to raise some you've obviously seen some diversity of views, and I want to synthesize a couple of the diversity of views. There seems to be this tension in the goals of the program in terms of the number of units versus where those units are located, because of course, if you insist on a very high opportunity neighborhood, that land's very expensive, it's very expensive to build, and if I think the priority is building a lot of cheap units for 30% AMI, I'm going to choose somewhere cheap, and that's not a high opportunity neighborhood. And I just want to get the panelists' views on how you think about that tension. And I mean, it comes up in a lot of housing policies. I had a conversation with Jenny last year where she was talking about inclusionary zoning. She's like, oh yeah, if you think this is an affordability tool, no, it's just a tax on developers. If I'm paraphrasing correctly. If you think it's about increasing neighborhood diversity, then maybe the handful of units that have been built with it, maybe it's more effective. And this is a short tension, but I want to get your thoughts on where you think we should be building LIHTC units. And I'll start with Mike.
So as far as where I would prefer, and I think this is kind of Adam and I sort of discuss, is the elastic versus inelastic kind of areas, right? And it really comes down to crowd out and kind of the incidents. And I think this is I think it's somewhat of an unresolved good question. For me still, I would prefer to target where housing's unaffordable, which is generally where it's inelastic. Now the question is there more or less crowd out there? One argument is in San Francisco, we're building nothing ever, or Los Angeles. So if we actually build more units, I would view that's going to have less offsets. And if we're literally building 30 units and there's never going to be 30 units there, especially of multifamily kind of low quality, that's really where I would probably focus at least the marginal kind of allocations. I think it's not unusual, and I think this is actually one of the features, not a glitch of the program, is that states get to sort of decide, right? And I think, if I could probably go one step further, I would love for some states to be able to decide, I want to spend more on housing. I want to take that same money, I want to do equity raise, but I want to spend it on homeownership, or I want to spend it on more housing vouchers. So, again, I think those are probably the two features that I have, and I really like the state control of this program. But also, there's cases like Mississippi and Alabama where it's probably not being used as well. So,
within a city, which tracks?
Okay.
Which tracks do you want to allocate LIHTC to?
No, I'm going to say something else. Okay, good. I think when you're looking at this, the first question that comes to my mind is, what is the market failure? Because then we should just set the price correctly to overcome that externality, so whatever that is. So I think first, really rethinking what is the goal of this program, I think really does matter, right? We had someone come up, and I actually have been very impressed with the developers, the county officials, the state officials, the city officials that I've talked to in Utah here and in Minneapolis and other places, just about how they're thinking about affordable housing. But then I stepped back listening today, and I was like, you're talking about trying to build subsidized housing in a ski resort town. Why? Like, I have a Maserati I would like to buy. Will you subsidize my Maserati? So I think the question is, what is that market failure? And maybe there is a market failure.
It's kids. It's kids. They don't choose this, and we know they have bad outcomes. That's the market failure.
But children should live in ski resort towns?
They work there.
I mean, the kids don't work there.
Maybe they'll, maybe not.
It's if they do, and if that's a good thing, I think we should do that. And then that's what I'm saying. I actually think we should expand LIHTC and actually provide deeper subsidies to really target if that's the goal. But I think we haven't thought through maybe what the goal is in terms of where these developments are going.
Can I pose to you, what do you think the market failure is? You want to go?
Yeah, so I've thought a lot about this, right? And I think it very much relates to what Jenny discussed. We keep going back to her. So in my opinion, if I really look at the left tail, kind of the low costs, right? We make it really hard to build low quality, I hate to say it, low cost units, right? We really truncate the distribution. And I think that's the failure that we really try to address. I think from a developer perspective, again, because of those regulations, right, they're probably a fixed cost per unit that if you're going to endure the fixed cost of building a unit, you might as well build a really nice, like a unit, right? I mean, I like to view it, and I think this is as far as, it's a project I'm working on, you're going to build 40,000 square feet of multifamily space, right? You could build 40 units of affordable housing and have to build a lot of parking with it, or you can build 10 really nice luxury units. Your cost is roughly the same probably for that, but you're much more likely to get those luxury units approved. And I think with the tax credit program, what we could do is try to at least nudge those developers to endure those regulatory costs.
Great. Since I can't get my question answered directly, I'm opening it up to the floor. Aaron.
So, very enjoyable. I'm curious, because at least in Missouri, and I suspect it's not just Missouri, the political debate is actually around what the state does, which is the state has a program on top of the federal one. Like the state actually matches it. And it's very popular there. Developers make all sorts of arguments for why it's critical. Some of them are very creative arguments. So I'm just sort of curious, again, have you looked at these kind of state supplemental programs? Do they seem to have any marginal benefit above and beyond just the federal? Have you guys?
So most state programs, so basically, and this is very much Nate's point, so you have these difficult development areas or qualified census tracts where you get this 30% boost. So in California, at least, the state tax credits, and about 80% of states probably have some boost of some regard, some subsidy, is they actually help subsidize high land cost areas, right? So these opportunity areas, and I think, this is sort of the debate is, economists, I think, always say, okay, well, this isn't perfect. And I think from the political world, and I think, again, this was the conversation kind of earlier, right? This is a very popular program, right? Both ends of the spectrum kind of get a win, I sort of view this. And I think, again, I very common, I think.
I mean, let me just rephrase what I think he said. If the state actually has a very good plan for what they want to do in terms of developing places, and the federal subsidy isn't enough to sort of get that done, then I think these state things that targeted, and you've heard this from all three of us, if it's being used in a way that's targeted in a good way, then I think that makes sense. And I think that's what the evidence and the literature would say as well.
Richard, and then Jenny, and then the gentleman. The other gentleman.
So, Adam, I don't think you're a bad person. I do think actually the LIHTC program is awful, but we're stuck with it. And when I was working at HUD in the Obama administration, I would say to people, why don't we take this money and put it into Section 8? And they said, well, because we can't do that. So we're sort of stuck with this thing. But with that in mind, I want to ask a couple of questions. First of all, just a technical question is, on Mike, you say you get $1.17 of subsidy for every dollar you spend. Given that it's a 90% credit, I'm just curious how that works. I would think the present value can't be more than
right. So
than the 90 cents. And so I want to ask that. And then I have a question for the panel, just as policy. Couldn't a margin of calibration just be the size of the credit? So you're getting 3-to-1 applications to awards. I've had students do incidence analysis that show like 80% of the benefit goes to developers and 20% goes to the people who are renting the place. Maybe they don't need 9. Maybe, you know, you have some sort of formula where they get 2 or you get to the point where the NPV is $1 more than would be the case if they didn't do it. But you're giving away a lot of money with 9%. And is there a way you could recalibrate that number?
So I'll go first. How do I get the 117? And I think you raised a very important point. So since 2008, roughly, you get 9% of the basis for 10 years. And that's paid as a 10-year as far as like an annuity. So that's where you get, in a nominal sense, 90% of the value. You multiply that by 1.3. That's how you get this 1.17%. Now, to your point, it's 117% tax credits. And then that's subject then to the market to discount it. So this is kind of where I say, you know, we used to use the applicable, like the federal rate. And again, there's a lot of things going on here, but you know, ultimately, right, you're right. It's probably, I think I calculated it's about $1.03 for every $1 once you factor in, I think, a 3% discount rate or 2.5, whatever the applicable federal rate is, these sort of 5 and 7 year. So that's the present value calculation. So.
I have a question for Utah, if anyone knows this. So how overprescribed were LIHTC credits this year?
The last PAB was about 2 times overprescribed on the non-competitive 4%. So about 50% of the affordable deals that came through for the 4% this week, Monday, were denied.
Yeah. Jenny?
I mean, I'm sure you could, you know, right now the competition works by, you know, either behind the scenes where like you hire a consultant to tell you that you should charge this rent and, you know, build this amenity. You could have the competition be on how many dollars you get. Obviously, that's not the way the program works, but I mean, we do that for other programs. We basically auction them off, right? And you can say, I'll do it for 6% a year instead of 9%, and then maybe that person should get the credit. I mean, you could do it that way.
I can agree more. That's exactly.
But this is part of the calibration thing. That's why I asked about Utah, which is if you see way over prescription, then you know how to move this over time, right? And so,
just to clarify, so that was on the 4% credit. On the 9%, the competitive credit, it has been oversubscribed every year up until this last round that we just had.
Yeah,
I was undersubscribed. Part of that's because Utah received an extra nearly $6 million in state credit, or I'm sorry, federal credits because of the earthquake that we had last year.
Oh, okay.
And so that kicked in a whole bunch more credits for the state, which was really beneficial. So that pushed some projects a little earlier that would have applied maybe this round to apply previously. So, but it has across the nation this year, the demand for the 9% credit has gone down a little bit while the 4% credit demand has skyrocketed.
Right. But that's partly because we in the last year increased the generosity, right? So it was about a 3% increase. We probably increased it, about 32%. So it's not surprising because you're able to layer these other subsidies in. Again, if I'm a developer, and correct me if I'm wrong for the developer in the room, usually there's a high consultant cost fee to figure out how to kind of fine tune to get a bid. If you get a non-competitive bid, now if you still get them denied, as we heard, but that's much more a function of not a limited supply. It's about having a viable project, at least as, you know, the municipal bonds is kind of the binding constraint. So I don't know if that's, is that true from your perspective? Yeah.
Jenny?
So I'm 100% with Adam that we should not be throwing more money at inelastic places without asking them to reduce the cost of construction. Okay. It costs $450,000 per unit to build a LIHTC unit in San Francisco, and you're going to make that affordable. San Francisco and California should not get a penny more in LIHTC until they make it cheaper to build, and that should absolutely be one of the things on the table to make them change their rules. The other thing is, so we're talking all about construction, right? And how much would it cost to do construction and where you're allowed to get permission to do construction. It's very hard to do that in high opportunity neighborhoods where we want kids to be growing up. You could also make LIHTC more friendly to doing acquisition and rehab. So instead of using LIHTC to build a bunch of high concentrated poverty, expensive units in Acosta, you buy older existing apartment buildings in Tenleytown and Cleveland Park. They already exist, take them out of the supply of market rate housing, put them under long-term affordability restrictions so that low-income people can live in high opportunity neighborhoods and send their kids to schools, and let the private market take care of building market rate construction at much lower cost. And then I'm going to throw one more thing on the political side. It's not just the subsidy is going to developers who are building this stuff. There is a huge industry of consultants and syndicators who live off of this business, right? Liskin Enterprise and all of the consultants who make the complicated financing packages work, they get paid by doing these deals. And I will say that a lot of them would actually tell you they'd be totally happy for the program to go away, for them not to be in business, to have simpler subsidies where you could actually spend more of the subsidy getting to low-income residents instead of paying all of the middlemen. But that's part of the political popularity too, right? A lot of people get paid off of this.
Yeah. Well said.
Gentleman in the white shirt had a comment, yeah.
Yeah, my question is more for Adam. So you focused a lot on saying, the developments are in low-income neighborhoods, right? So as a developer, I get a 130% basis boost, so I can get my basis boost if I build in a QCT. So I build in a QCT. So the qualified census tract is low income, and HUD determines those and says, hey, this is a low income neighborhood. So you've got a developer that's incentivized to build in a low income neighborhood, right? So if there's no incentive to build in Mill Creek, why? Because the land costs too much, and then nobody wants it there. Not those people. We don't want those people in my neighborhood. But so let's go build in Rose Park where it's a low income and it's a qualified census tract. So you're incentivizing the developer to build there. So it sounds like we're perpetuating the problem by giving the incentive to the developer to build in a low income neighborhood. I'd be curious to get your
it doesn't seem like a good feature.
How to fix that?
How to fix that? I think part of it is the schizophrenic goals of the program. I feel like the origin of the qualified census tract was like, well, let's use LIHTC as a tool to rehabilitate a neighborhood and have new buildings go into the neighborhood. I think there's some evidence that it does in a blighted neighborhood. Having a new building helps. But obviously, it works at odds with another goal of the program, which is to not concentrate kids in bad neighborhoods. The same is true.
So
go ahead.
Vicky Bean has a question, so she has a paper on this. And basically, when we did QCTs, the idea was, as Adam said, this was supposed to be a targeted rehabilitation, and it had to be other neighborhood goals. But we went away from that. That was in the early 90s when we passed QCTs. Since 2016, though, I'm sure it was basically we also give a basis boost, one for a difficult development area, which are defined at zip codes. And there's 5 zip codes in Salt Lake City. I looked this up yesterday. I don't know my neighborhoods well, but you could also get that basis boost there. So they're trying to balance it out, but you still kind of get the schizophrenic goal where, again, you get this basis boost for a high opportunity neighborhood and a QCT. I think because I've ran this, people are still building in the QCTs, and that's because the land is cheaper, right? At the end of the day, we aren't subsidizing land, and you also don't have the regulation, right? You don't have the neighborhood opposition there. So my view at one point was, why even have QCTs at all? We'd get a lot more units through this program if we didn't have any QCTs or DDAs, but.
I think some of the tension here is how much we think. I think the argument for funding this from government money in general is about kids and the fact that we have to pay for them if they're incarcerated, and that's expensive, and other adverse outcomes. But I don't think we know really the benefits of being adequately housed for a kid relative to being housed in a high opportunity neighborhood. Both inadequate housing and being housed in a high poverty neighborhood seem not great. But I don't really know that we know which is worse, and I don't really know the inadequate housing. We've talked about we want to actually incentivize smaller units. If I could redesign the housing supply, I would like a whole bunch of 900 square foot 3-bedroom apartments, because that's very adequate housing for a family, but we don't build that sort of unit right now. But I don't know. Am I thinking of this trade-off correctly?
Well, my sense is that if your family is at 60% of AMI, you're not on the border of homelessness. You're getting a lower. In the absence of the program, you'd be living in a less nice, older vintage apartment So they're not unhoused.
Well, I guess I think of it mostly, though, as providing filtering. I think of it, and I think the extent to which filtering works has to depend on how close the substitute is between new housing stock and the existing housing stock. And a little bit of my concern with how many studio and one bedrooms, I mean, it's still better than no new housing, but I don't know how substitutable that is for families that are coming in and buying up existing housing stock. I just don't know the level. And I've seen like HUD 228 projects being built with micro units. And I'm like, how is this? I don't know. It just doesn't seem consistent with the goals.
I mean, I think if it's targeted for homelessness, right? So in my view, a single room occupancy, I've never seen a developer saying, you know, I want to build some housing for homeless people. And I think if we could bundle that with services and mental health services, all those things, I think that's the lowest hanging fruit from a policy perspective. And I think you could do that. And again, I think that's sort of the challenge is there's so many different goals we're trying to solve with this. Because I think large families, rentals is probably right up there with the homelessness, right? And you probably need a lot of big units, a lot of small units probably is what we're missing in the market, so.
So Andrew, I'm curious about your filtering argument. So filtering is like this idea that we could build luxury condos, and then people from the avenues will move into those luxury condos, and people from Sugar House will move into the avenues, and then free up housing in Sugar House for low-income housing purposes. And then I guess is the idea that we shouldn't allow updates to houses in the Sugar House area because we want to keep those houses sort of depreciating.
Okay, so Shinshin, my dear colleague Shinshin, who is now one of Gregor's colleagues. I don't know where Gregor is, but Shinshin. So I used to live in Durham, and I had this colleague, Shinshin, and her husband, who, Durham is actually one of the most rapidly gentrifying areas of the country right now. And when Shinshin and her husband moved there, so downtown Durham has a lot of not great housing stock, but it's being bought up by higher income residents. Fortunately, they've also adopted a pro-development perspective where they're putting up nice, new, shiny condos. And Shinshin and her husband were considering one of these dilapidated houses, and then they did not because they had this nice, shiny condo they could buy. High-income people would rather live in nice, shiny, new housing if it's available to them. If you don't allow that construction, they will crowd in on the existing housing stock. Now, about LIHTC, this is the question. I think what we don't know is how well filtering, what sort of housing supply we want to incentivize to accelerate filtering. Do we want to build for the very high end, or do we want to build, but I'm pretty sure that for Shinshin, a brand new studio was not a good substitute. That's my sort of concern, is that we need, where she would have been crowding in on was the family stock. We could keep talking about this.
Over drinks, though.
But over drinks. So we're going to go over to the Utah Museum of Fine Arts, which is about 2 buildings away. If you don't know where, find a local, we'll walk you there, but it really is 2 buildings away. My guess is Kendra has put up signs everywhere. Kendra and Dylan's back there. They'll tell you where to go. Thank you very much. Try it. I don't think it's adequate. I don't think it's the only
But then, we don't want to allow redevelopment of areas in inner cities. That's the weird.
So like, 50% of these units are rehabs.
So really?
Yeah,
I didn't know idea.
So 40% of units are rehab. And like, the rehabs make my head spin for LIHTC. They make my head spin because I know several deals where they took housing that was already really affordable, that was low quality. We gave them $10 million of subsidy, and the exact same households moved right back in, but they got a higher quality unit. And I have a hard time trying to figure out,
is that like use of money
right,
or not?
Right. Now you would make an argument. Now would that
Lead-based
landlord
paint is a
would,
problem,
would that landlord demolish that place in the absence? Like, what would they do with that unit if they didn't get that?
Yeah, no, I mean the quality.
last 150 years. This is my point. Right?
Yeah, I mean the low quality housing. I mean, I think in some ways we want to allow that, but we like low quality housing in terms of like mobile homes and in terms of like small unit size.
You can't, you have so many building codes and building rules, you can't build like super crappy.
Right.
Yeah, but there is an issue with some of these, like the lead-based paint. Like this is a really big problem.
And they can't mitigate. So
they haven't fixed them
You know
everywhere.
what the hell? But they don't have to. So did you guys hear the talk about the single-family tax credit that was talked about today, neighborhood homes tax credit? So this is what I've been talking to Wall Street Journal about. I bet it was wrong. Article. So one of the things they're doing, this is a single-family housing tax credit that a private equity firm, if they buy a house, if they rehab up to $40,000, so basically there's this gap financing for Cincinnati, you have all this beautiful crappy housing that will cost, currently you gotta spend $50,000 to mitigate lead paint. Right, so the idea is to get, if they're going to spend $40 billion, so Wall Street Journal, I was very right? I think it helps private firms buying
Thank you guys.
That was
Don't
great.
have
Great.
time.
Thank you.
Everyone in their pictures. Oh, we're so unique, we've all
Yeah, I was
They're probably
so let's just before you go to the next.
So you started this yeah, a little bit more
No, it would be next. Yeah, it would be the winners that we.
exactly. Right. The case law isn't there, so it's something where I will say, we could do it in New York.
One of the people who loves.
So what I do is so I started. I was every couple of
Very lively to come up with questions. Always lively to like. So
what I do is
thank you so much for coming.
To create stuff that feels self-sustaining, right? Like,
A lot of people don't.
You would have that in, to sort of do all the groundwork of the interaction with every subsidizing to do this. And I'm going to talk to you about
And I'm like, we're like, if you had some centralized,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like uncomfortable.
No, I don't have a car. No, you figured prominent.
What did I do?
I can't remember, but it was.
Do you remember Abbott?
Oh, no, I didn't, yeah, no, as soon as you said that, that's exactly what.
It drives me into basically, so I first meeting.
She really wants to right now that, you know, I felt like we were advising you have to hire a realtor to transact.
There is.
I don't know.
What we're doing. So we'll have about an hour, that's really the hour price to keep them on tomorrow. The client is kind of talking about what they're doing, some interaction with them, and they're going
No, it's not like. I already bought my house, so, also
Well, I took a class in undergrad, actually, you wouldn't remember me, it was like 5 years ago.
Is he sorry right beside me? Like last time after the time.
Yeah, it's early morning class, so I don't know if I was at my best at 8 a.m. but it inspired an interest. A little bit.
This is where we know.
Yeah, I'm just really sort of tangentially, but not well.
You see my talk, it's actually just.
Unfortunately, the class makes it very interesting.
When did you leave Harvard and go to Connecticut?
So I was there in undergrad. I'm actually back there at law school.
Oh, you are?
Doing things all easier. To sit and meet with every legislator, go to every town and everything. Yeah, third year. Department of Justice, CFPB, something like that.
That's a pretty good idea. I still think some possibilities in discrimination, there's some possibilities.
I was in the back, trying to wake myself up, so I did not make much of an impression. I'm afraid.
Well, and they don't feel like.
Because you've been nominated. Ivory Prize.
Yes, that's right.
And so we'll have a chance to, as a part of it, we have to recruit ourselves. To the judges.
Fantastic.
Yes, yes.
So the next event is in the Utah Museum of Fine Arts, and actually put out the doors at the end of the building.
And that's what
Yes, she's powerhouse, so I'm her number 2, and she pushes us very, very hard, but she gets results.
But that's a great thing to be doing while you're going to school. What a fun, in the middle of the action event.
Yeah, it's a mix of policy work and the political work, which, when they collide, it's not always what's fun, but it's interesting anyway. So, yes, I'll,
You want to get us out? Is that what you're trying to do?
Coming in to clean up.
Phil, thank you very much. Good job.
Thanks so much.
Phil, I was not trying to ask you a gotcha question. Are you on the phone?
No, yeah.
I was not trying to ask you a gotcha question. I was trying to set you up. Because my conversation with Phil.
Hold on.
The whole thing about, law costs.
Right.
There was a conversation with you. So I was trying to set up that answer.
Thank you.
But I
Your comments
was
were
like.
many. Oh, it's okay. It's a
I don't believe it. I didn't take the bait well, is that what you said?
I would see are like really awesome kind of speakers.
Or the social media, or listening.
I know, we were.
I didn't want to offer.
We're someone, we have it.
we're talking about easy resolution.
We
So,
have.
so, I know it was, and that's where he was. Like,
Yes.
when we first went out, like, we would talk to people like McCargo Foundation, and like, can you give us all the cost of capital, or we can lower the rents and lower the.
I know, every single thing that comes up,
There
you're
was
like,
actually
oh, that's I mean, the LIHTC stuff is
why are
also
you assuming
too, because I'm
that
also
we
like,
need lower cost capital?
I mean,
What we need is.
they haven't, it's such an interesting debate for people who have never put engine in the air, we've never had that move, right? So there's a lot of things that for me that I'm like, I don't know if the reality is a part of this conversation,
Well,
you know?
and you talk about reality, right? I've been calling them universes because I'm in this sort of social front line.
Initially, it was very
Yeah.
much driven by CRA conversation.
I think that's better.
We were talking to change.
Yeah, it does.
And there is scientific evidence to support that.
Well, there's a
It's
Journal of
huge.
Public Economics paper
Yeah.
that just happened.
So like you don't have to, no, we do really
Chase
have
put up
science.
another.
Do you really know?
We know, and it's such a big deal, and that's why I'm like, but I'm also like, and with LIHTC, I mean, there's all these things, right? Like, it is an incentive, it's not like builders are trying to like, come, I don't know, not every, it's so interesting, because it's like, and they're limited, and I thought it was just such an interesting conversation.
I think that was.
Especially from the perspective of like, I wish I would have put someone
No,
up there who
my daughter's asking me
built
about
the units,
PPOs.
that's the perspective I was missing, and the whole time I was like,
I probably will do it.
okay,
Good to see.
She's on the state.
Okay.
yeah,
She has
we'll
like
put her up there.
property specifically for business. No, but they
We're
said
gonna
that
do-
won't happen.
Hold on,
Yeah, I was the person last night.
Yes.
I'll.
The warring women.
Yes, yes. Well, not before.
Well, no, they are warring the world together.
That's what I.
We work with a lot of, yes, we do. I have an intergenerational poverty intervention. We piloted it, now we're scaling it.
Or you go
Obviously, for one is housing.
No.
Right.
So your
It's
model
actually
is
phenomenal.
phenomenal.
It's like,
As well as we have the first
but like, we pulled in
So I
the
don't know
top
if you know
and
that
we just like
hill.
have a discussion
It's
on like,
responsible
what are you
for
doing,
like
what do you
25,000
see, and like kind of have her get to
Wow.
know each other, learn from each other.
Davis Weaver. It's our largest employer, right?
Yeah, yeah, so we'll
Right.
over research that a lot,
Huge.
and it's just, it's research for,
Yeah.
I'll just come grab you, and then we'll get you on the phone.
All sorts of positive
Yeah.
energy.
Chris.
Anyway, long story short.
Nice to meet you in person, yeah.
We have airmen that are 18,
Not at all, not at all.
that are single, that
He's like,
they're
yes,
leaving the
like,
base.
and I said,
They get 30 days
and I look back at this,
parents
like,
housing when they're arriving here.
Okay.
And they
And we're all in it, we're in it.
Everyone's
Somebody
in
emails,
it.
I do not,
30
you for 1 second think about it.
We're negative 100 just availability, so the options for free
Yeah, whenever
Yeah.
you send over.
is actually, and their model,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yes.
It's you know.
Yeah.
Reliable.
Yeah, so to find an option.
It's always true with military, by the way.
Well,
I get your point. I get your point.
18-year-old.
But here's the thing about Utah, that here's the thing that you may or may not know.
Okay.
If something happens, if you put somebody in charge of it, and something happens, it works on time. Everybody knows everything. Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that's the way to do it.
So if you do it under, like, we have a whole bunch of associations that have savings and money on it, appropriations share.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it would, these
So
individuals
how,
are
so how
very,
far
very
you
well.
have yourself this?
Yeah,
So we're like, you're north of Ogden? Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes and no. So Ogden is a city within Weaver County.
Okay.
So we
That's what I
are one
thought,
and the
that's
same.
what I thought.
Yeah. So we're north of, so Davis County is kind of a suburb in between Salt Lake and Ogden.
Okay,
And then Ogden is where the Golden Spike went in.
okay.
So it's the old, so the Brigham Young South Salt Lake. We have the rip roaring brothels, and so we have 150 acres.
Oh, good to meet you. Yes, I've heard a lot of that.
So we have
You were
So we have.
It's like a very clear identifier. You pull that card out and it's like.
Children on
Nice,
stage, like, we
nice.
were like, it's like 20 minutes to Salt Lake and an hour and a half up to Ogden, right? So, you know what, that's okay, but we don't have. But here's my point is we're, part of the county, part behavioral health, part health department, et so we have this intergenerational poverty initiative, so we are working with women of domestic violence who are really phenomenal women. And I mean, we have this one gal, she lives in an illegal fourplex, and so I have a rehousing program because city code enforcement doesn't let me out. She's an autistic son.
What are you thinking about in terms of combining?
So we'll help with employment too, by the way. We'll help with like home ownership, like what does that mean?
Yeah.
So if there's two, we're probably thinking each one of them at least 40,000. So you're looking at combined at least.
We had this conversation in Chicago with the group. Do we have to get out of here?
Yeah, we're cleaning it up,
We
but
can walk towards.
come walk with me and I'll take you. Yeah, we're walking towards, oh, just some drinks and some snacks. So you have something. Great job today, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't feel very good about it.
You did?
Oh, it was great. It was
Why were
absolutely
you
great.
stressing on that? You know what, you're like me, I'm always so pessimistic, I'm like, oh, that doesn't
Yeah.
I know. Yeah.
You was just, so John Stewart says, right? He's like,
Yeah, we got it for now, we're gonna come over, so, but someone's coming in and speaking. Yeah, we have a PMBA class. So, done. So, the backdrop? No, oh, that's right, pull it down, yeah, we'll set it up tomorrow. All right, sounds good, thank you.
Hey, I have a backpack in here. Do you still have, it's blue, it's over by the computer? Okay, yeah, I mean, I can hold on to, I bring it up to our office, but I just wasn't sure. Okay, perfect. Of course, bye.